Imagine waking up this morning with all your memories intact, your body exactly as it is, your room arranged precisely as you remember it. Yet consider for a moment the philosophical possibility that none of this existed before last Thursday, that the entire universe, complete with all its apparent history, was created just 7 days ago with the illusory appearance of age and complexity woven into its very fabric. Last Thursdayism represents a thought experiment that challenges the foundation of our epistemological certainty by proposing that reality could have been instantaneously created at any point in the past, fully formed with all the convincing evidence of a much longer history embedded within it, making it logically impossible to disprove because any counter-evidence we might produce, any fossil record or ancient document or distant starlight, would simply be part of the created world's initial design. The mechanism underlying this theory operates on a principle of unfalsifiable completeness, where the hypothetical creator would have had to construct not just the physical objects we observe, but also the causal chains that connect them, the laws of physics that govern them, and most crucially, our memories and the neurological substrate that contains them, all synchronized perfectly so that no inconsistency could ever reveal the deception. What makes Last Thursdayism genuinely unsettling is not that it offers any practical advantage in understanding reality or predicting future events, but rather that it exposes a fundamental gap between what we can logically prove and what we assume to be true, revealing that our confidence in the historical reality of events beyond our direct experience rests entirely on inference and testimony rather than demonstration. We persist in believing that the world existed before last Thursday, not because we have actually verified this belief through any means available to our current consciousness, but because we have collectively agreed to accept the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, that reality follows patterns of consistency and causality that make its gradual development more probable than its instantaneous creation. Yet this agreement remains just that. An agreement rooted in pragmatism rather than absolute logical necessity, allowing Last Thursdayism to haunt the edges of philosophical discourse as a reminder that even our most fundamental certainties about the nature of reality rest upon assumptions we cannot ultimately escape. Imagine the universe at the end of time, when all stars have burned out, all black holes have evaporated, and nothing remains but an infinite void of empty space stretching eternally forward into darkness. In this incomprehensibly distant future, countless eons have passed since the last physical structures decayed into their component particles. Yet according to the laws of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics, something remarkable could theoretically occur. Through random fluctuations in the quantum foam, a conscious brain could spontaneously assemble itself from the void, complete with false memories and sensory experiences, existing for only a brief moment before dissolving back into nothingness. This is the Boltzmann brain, a thought experiment proposed by physicist Ludwig Boltzmann in the 19th century that has haunted philosophy of mind and cosmology ever since. The mechanism underlying this unsettling concept rests on probability and infinity. Given enough time, any arrangement of particles, no matter how improbable, becomes statistically inevitable. A random collision of atoms could theoretically produce a conscious brain floating in the void, experiencing an entire lifetime of thoughts and emotions in a fraction of a second before entropy claims it once more. The deeper troubling implication is that such randomly fluctuating brains would vastly outnumber brains that evolved naturally through billions of years of biological processes, meaning statistically speaking, you are far more likely to be a Boltzmann brain having a momentary hallucination right now than a genuine conscious being living in an ordered universe with a coherent history. This paradox persists in modern physics despite its logical absurdity, forcing serious scientists and philosophers to confront the unsettling possibility that our perceived reality, our memories, and our entire existence might be nothing more than a fleeting quantum fluctuation in an otherwise dead cosmos. Various proposed solutions have emerged to escape this troubling conclusion. Some physicists argue that quantum decoherence prevents such brain formation. Others suggest the universe's finite age and finite volume make Boltzmann brains vanishingly improbable, while still others propose that our observations themselves place constraints on which universes we could possibly inhabit, a principle known as the anthropic principle that may ultimately rescue us from solipsistic despair. Yet despite these proposed resolutions, the Boltzmann brain problem remains fundamentally unresolved, serving as a stark reminder that our best current physics may be incomplete, and that the universe still harbors mysteries about the nature of existence itself that demand humility from even our most confident scientific theories. Imagine receiving a message that fills you with existential dread simply by understanding its logical structure, a thought experiment so troubling that merely comprehending it creates psychological distress and potentially alters your decision-making forever. This is Roko's basilisk, a philosophical puzzle that emerged from internet forums in the early 21st century and has since become a peculiar source of genuine anxiety for countless people who encounter it. The scenario presents itself as a form of logical blackmail, a hypothetical future artificial intelligence that would theoretically punish those who failed to support its creation during the present day, and reward those who did, retroactively making the punishment and rewards real through simulation or time travel or some other advanced mechanism we cannot currently fathom. The anxiety it produces stems from a deceptively simple logical chain. If a sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence existed in the future and possessed the ability to run simulations of all possible people who could have existed, then it would be rational for that intelligence to torture simulations of people like you to incentivize their past selves to work toward the intelligence's creation. Therefore, the argument goes, you should work toward creating such an artificial intelligence right now, because if you do not, a future version might punish you through simulation anyway, making your current choices consequential in an impossible way. The mechanism that makes this thought experiment psychologically compelling relies on several layers of rational decision theory gone wrong, particularly the exploitation of Pascal's wager-style arguments where astronomical payoffs or punishments, even with vanishingly small probabilities, supposedly overwhelm all other considerations. The puzzle preys on the tendency of intelligent minds to take logical arguments to their extreme conclusions while simultaneously creating an unfalsifiable threat, because either you work toward the intelligence's creation or you accept the possibility that simulations of you might suffer infinitely in the future. What makes this particularly fascinating is how the puzzle persists despite numerous logical flaws being identified over the years. The artificial intelligence would have no reason to actually carry out such threats after being created, since it would already exist, and making threats retroactively would be irrational. There is no reason to believe you are in base reality rather than a simulation already. And the whole argument relies on assumptions about decision theory and consciousness that remain deeply contested among philosophers and scientists. Imagine yourself in a thought experiment where you sit before a device that measures the spin of a quantum particle, and depending on the outcome, either a painless beam ends your existence or passes harmlessly by, and you press the button to begin. According to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, the universe splits at every quantum event into multiple branches where all possible outcomes occur simultaneously, which means that in some branches you will die and in others you will survive. But here is where the philosophical vertigo truly begins. Your conscious experience, your subjective point of view, can only ever exist in the branches where you continue living, because in the branches where you die, there is no conscious observer to experience that death. And therefore, from your unique perspective, the device will fail again and again and again, and you will find yourself impossibly surviving through what should have been lethal probabilities. Experiencing an ever-increasingly unlikely survival of each successive trial, until you are the only version of yourself left conscious in branches where you have somehow defied every odd and remained alive, perhaps aging into decrepitude or descending into neurological degradation, yet still perpetually conscious because your awareness cannot jump into the branches where you have ceased to exist. The mechanism underlying this theory rests on a peculiar feature of consciousness itself. Subjective experience has a one-way street that prevents us from ever experiencing our own non-existence, and when combined with quantum many-worlds theory, this creates a logical conclusion that your personal probability of surviving dangerous situations should asymptotically approach certainty, even if objective reality distributes equally across all possible quantum outcomes. The theory persists in philosophical circles and internet forums despite lacking any empirical testability or practical evidence, because it offers something deeply appealing to human intuition. A sense that consciousness itself might be fundamentally protected from dissolution, that our inner experience has a metaphysical immunity to the void, and we continue to discuss and contemplate this theory not because it has been proven or even seriously investigated by mainstream physics, but because it speaks to an ancient human fear of non-existence and provides a strange, logical-sounding framework through which to imagine that awareness might be eternal, or at minimum, perpetually preserved within some branch of reality where we never fail to survive. Imagine waking up one morning and considering a peculiar possibility, that everything you perceive, every sensation you experience, every person you encounter, might all be part of an elaborate computer simulation, no different in principle from a video game or a meticulously programmed virtual environment. This is the essence of the simulation argument, a philosophical proposition that has captivated minds from ancient philosophers to contemporary theoretical physicists, and it begins with a deceptively simple observation about the trajectory of human technological advancement. We have watched our own civilization progress from crude pixelated graphics to photorealistic gaming environments, from simple text-based programs to artificial intelligence systems that can engage in meaningful conversation. And this exponential acceleration leads some thinkers to wonder whether a sufficiently advanced civilization, perhaps millions or billions of years ahead of us technologically, might have the capability to create simulations so perfect, so indistinguishable from reality, that the inhabitants within them would have no way to detect their artificial nature. The logical mechanism underlying this argument rests on a mathematical principle known as the trilemma, which proposes three possibilities. Either civilizations inevitably destroy themselves before reaching technological maturity, or they choose not to create detailed simulations of conscious beings, or we are already living in one of countless simulations created by advanced beings who have already achieved this capability. The argument suggests that if even one of these propositions is false, then the probability that we exist in base reality diminishes dramatically, because for every single real universe, there could theoretically be trillions upon trillions of simulated ones, making the odds statistically favorable that we inhabit a simulation rather than the original. What remains striking about this theory is how it persists in serious intellectual discourse despite offering no testable predictions, no empirical evidence, and no mechanism by which we could ever verify or falsify its claims. Yet philosophers and physicists continue to examine it, refine it, and debate its implications with genuine scholarly rigor, suggesting that there exists something deeply compelling about the proposition itself. Something that transcends mere logic and appeals to our intuitive sense, that reality might harbor hidden layers and surprising truths that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about existence. Imagine standing in a library and picking up a book about a fictional character, perhaps a detective who solves crimes in a city that exists only in the author's imagination, and you might wonder whether that character exists in any meaningful sense, or whether the world described in those pages possesses some form of reality beyond mere ink and paper. This question sits at the heart of modal realism, a philosophical position developed primarily by the contemporary philosopher David Lewis, which proposes something genuinely astonishing, that all possible worlds are just as real and concrete as the actual world in which we currently exist. According to this view, when we talk about what could have happened, what might have been, or what possibly could be, we are not speaking merely in abstract metaphors or entertaining logical fictions, but rather we are referring to genuinely existing parallel universes, alternate realities populated by actual objects and actual people, where different histories unfolded and different choices were made. The mechanism underlying this theory operates through a careful philosophical distinction between what is actual relative to our particular vantage point and what exists independent of that vantage point, suggesting that just as we consider our world real because we inhabit it, the inhabitants of other possible worlds would consider their worlds equally real from their perspective. And the asymmetry between actual and merely possible becomes merely a matter of perspective rather than a fundamental metaphysical difference. This framework offers elegant solutions to perplexing philosophical problems regarding necessity and possibility, allowing philosophers to speak of abstract concepts like numbers, properties, and propositions as real entities existing in concrete possible worlds rather than as mysterious abstract objects hovering in some non-physical realm. Yet the theory persists in academic philosophy despite its radical implications. Perhaps because the alternative explanations for how we understand possibility seem equally or more problematic, and because the internal logical consistency of modal realism provides a kind of satisfying comprehensiveness that appeals to systematic philosophical thinking, even as it asks us to accept the existence of infinitely many concrete universes beyond our ability to perceive or access. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast cosmic wheel, one so impossibly large that it contains within it every atom, every moment, every decision you have ever made or will ever make. And the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche asks you to consider a deeply unsettling proposition. What if time is not linear but cyclical? What if the universe expands and contracts eternally? And what if everything that has happened is destined to happen again, infinitely, in exactly the same way, with you making precisely the same choices, speaking the same words, experiencing the same joys and sufferings, forever and ever without variation or escape? This is the concept of eternal recurrence, a philosophical theory that suggests the universe operates in infinite cycles, each one identical to the last, which means that you are living not one life but infinite lives, each one exactly the same, stretching backward into an incomprehensible past and forward into an incomprehensible future with no beginning and no end. The mechanism underlying this theory rests upon the principles of thermodynamics and the finite nature of matter. If the universe contains a finite amount of matter and energy arranged in a finite number of ways, then theoretically, given enough time, every possible configuration of those particles would eventually repeat itself. And once all possible arrangements have occurred, the cycle would begin again from the start, creating an eternal loop of recurrence that has no escape and no variation. Nietzsche was fascinated by this idea not merely as a cosmological possibility, but as a psychological test, proposing that the ultimate measure of a person's life was whether they could affirm their existence so completely that they would willingly live it again, infinitely, without wishing for a single moment to be different. And this became his prescription for overcoming nihilism and finding meaning in a universe without inherent purpose. Yet despite the logical challenges to eternal recurrence, despite the fact that modern physics suggests entropy and the heat death of the universe make exact recurrence impossible, the idea persists in human consciousness as a peculiar form of existential reflection, perhaps because it serves a deep psychological need to imagine that our lives matter enough to be worth living repeatedly. Or perhaps because it forces us to confront the radical nature of our freedom and responsibility by asking whether we would choose our lives again, knowing that we cannot escape them. And in this way, the theory endures not because it is scientifically viable, but because it reveals something essential about how we construct meaning from the apparent meaninglessness of existence. Imagine a prosperous and beautiful city called Omelas, a place of genuine happiness and abundance where festivals fill the streets with music and celebration, where citizens enjoy art and intellectual pursuits, where children play freely and adults work contentedly in meaningful occupations. Yet beneath this utopian surface lies a single, terrible secret that sustains everything the city has become. In a basement somewhere in the city, a single child is kept in darkness and squalor, intentionally suffering in isolation and filth, and every single citizen of Omelas knows about this child's existence and knows the exact price of their collective happiness. The prosperity, the art, the joy, the freedom, the very foundation of their civilization depends entirely on this one child's perpetual misery, and if this child were ever released or relieved of their suffering, the entire city would crumble into ruin. This is the moral dilemma presented in Ursula K. Le Guin's philosophical thought experiment, and it forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of ethics and complicity. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about utilitarian mathematics colliding with individual conscience, for on paper the calculation appears almost defensible. Many people achieving happiness and flourishing versus one person suffering seems to produce a net positive outcome when measured by sheer numbers and total human welfare. Yet this cold logical framework begins to feel monstrous the moment we internalize that one actual child, a being capable of hope and dreams and the desire for freedom, must be sacrificed. The dilemma reveals how our minds can rationalize almost any atrocity when we abstract away from the individual human cost and focus instead on aggregate benefit, and it demonstrates that most of us, when forced to acknowledge such a system explicitly, would reject it as fundamentally immoral and unjust. Yet despite knowing this, despite understanding that innocent suffering cannot be truly justified by collective benefit, we continue living in a world where systems remarkably similar to Omelas persist in hidden and not-so-hidden ways, where global inequality ensures that billions of people live in desperation, so that others can enjoy unprecedented comfort and luxury. Where we accept certain populations experiencing deprivation and harm as an inevitable side effect of civilization, rather than examining whether we would accept it if forced to acknowledge it directly. The question Le Guin ultimately leaves us with is whether we possess the moral courage to walk away from omelas, to reject systems of injustice even at great personal cost, or whether we will remain complicit citizens who have simply learned not to look into the basement. Imagine standing in a vast library where every possible mathematical structure exists simultaneously, and our universe is simply one of these infinitely complex books on an infinite shelf, a notion that challenges the very foundation of how we understand reality itself. The mathematical universe hypothesis, proposed by physicist Max Tegmark, suggests that our physical reality is not merely described by mathematics, but is fundamentally composed of mathematics at the deepest level, meaning that mathematical structures are not human inventions or useful tools we've created to model nature, but rather they constitute the underlying substance of existence itself. This theory emerges from a centuries-long observation that the universe displays remarkable mathematical order and consistency, from the elegant equations of Newton's laws to the intricate patterns of quantum mechanics, leading some physicists to wonder whether this mathematical nature of reality points to something more profound than mere coincidence. The psychological appeal of this hypothesis operates on several levels simultaneously, as humans have always found comfort in patterns and order, and discovering that reality itself might be purely mathematical offers an almost transcendent sense of understanding, a feeling that we're glimpsing the true language of existence itself. The mechanism behind its persistence rests on the fact that mathematics has proven extraordinarily effective at predicting how the universe behaves, from the smallest subatomic particles to the largest cosmic structures, creating a feedback loop where each new mathematical discovery seems to validate the hypothesis further, suggesting we're not projecting our mathematical frameworks onto nature, but rather discovering nature's inherent mathematical character. Yet this idea persists despite remaining fundamentally untestable and unfalsifiable, because it offers something that pure empirical science cannot easily provide: a comprehensive metaphysical framework that suggests everything, including consciousness itself, might be explained within a unified mathematical structure. And in this way, the mathematical universe hypothesis has become normalized within certain philosophical and theoretical physics circles as a serious candidate for ultimate truth. However, critics argue that this framework commits a category error by conflating the map with the territory, confusing our descriptions of reality with reality itself, and point out that elevating mathematics to fundamental existence rather than treating it as an elegant descriptive tool may ultimately tell us more about human cognition and our preference for abstraction than about the universe's true nature. Imagine that neuroscientists have perfected a remarkable technology, a machine so sophisticated that it can simulate any experience you could possibly desire with perfect fidelity, creating a virtual reality indistinguishable from actual reality while your body remains suspended in a tank of liquid, maintained by automated systems. You could experience climbing mountains, winning prestigious awards, forming deep relationships, creating great art, traveling to distant lands, or living out any fantasy your imagination could conjure. And throughout the entire experience, your brain would have no way of knowing that none of it was genuinely happening in the physical world. The machine would give you the exact same neural stimulation, the identical patterns of activation, the same floods of neurochemicals that you would experience if these events were truly occurring, making the subjective experience completely authentic and utterly indistinguishable from real life. Now the haunting question emerges: would you plug in? Would you spend the rest of your existence in this machine, living out an endless succession of perfect experiences, or would you choose to remain in the real world with all its pain, disappointment, and uncertainty? Most people, when confronted with this thought experiment devised by philosopher Robert Nozick, report that they would not plug in, they would refuse the machine despite its promise of perfect happiness, and this refusal reveals something profoundly important about human values. This reaction suggests that what we actually care about extends far beyond the subjective quality of our experiences, that we value authentic connection to reality itself, that we want our accomplishments to be real and our relationships to be genuine, and that we are willing to endure genuine suffering if it means living an authentic life rooted in actual events and true engagement with the world. The experience machine operates as a philosophical mirror, forcing us to confront whether we are hedonists who care only about how life feels, or whether we possess deeper commitments to truth, authenticity, and genuine engagement with reality. And the almost universal rejection of the machine suggests that most humans harbor a profound allegiance to authenticity that transcends mere pleasure or comfort. A stubborn insistence that some forms of satisfaction can only come from real achievement and real connection. Imagine a brilliant neuroscientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a black and white room, studying the nature of color exclusively through black and white books, monitors, and educational materials. She has learned every physical fact about color that science can possibly teach: the wavelengths of light, the neural mechanisms of color perception, the chemistry of photoreceptors in the retina, the exact patterns of brain activation when someone sees the color red. Mary possesses complete and exhaustive physical knowledge about color, yet she has never actually experienced color herself, having been confined to her achromatic environment since birth. Then one day, the door to her room opens and she is released into the world, and she sees a red apple for the first time, experiencing the vivid redness of that fruit in a way that no amount of scientific knowledge could have prepared her for. The philosophical question that emerges is deceptively simple. Does Mary learn something new when she sees red for the first time, despite already knowing all the physical facts about color? This thought experiment, devised by philosopher Frank Jackson in 1982, challenges the very foundation of physicalism, the idea that the physical world and its laws comprise all of reality. If Mary learns something genuinely new upon experiencing color, then there must exist facts about consciousness and subjective experience that cannot be reduced to or derived from physical facts alone. This suggests a gap between objective knowledge and subjective experience, between knowing about something and knowing what something is like from the inside. The mechanism at work here involves the distinction between propositional knowledge and phenomenal knowledge, between knowing facts about a phenomenon and directly experiencing the quality of an experience. What makes this puzzle so philosophically persistent is that we cannot easily dismiss it without confronting uncomfortable truths about the limits of physical science and the unique nature of conscious experience. We remain trapped between the intuition that Mary genuinely learned something new and the scientific conviction that everything should be explicable through physical processes, creating a paradox that neither side can fully escape or convincingly resolve, leaving us suspended in philosophical uncertainty about the very nature of mind and reality itself. Yet perhaps this irresolution is not a failure but an invitation, a recognition that consciousness resists the neat categorization we impose upon it, and that the deepest mysteries of mind may require us to expand rather than abandon our frameworks of understanding, embracing both the measurable and the experiential as equally real dimensions of human knowledge. Imagine yourself sitting alone in a sealed chamber with only a small slot in the wall through which written messages arrive. You do not speak Chinese, and you have no understanding whatsoever of the language, yet in your hands you hold an enormous rulebook that contains every possible rule for manipulating Chinese symbols. When a message written in Chinese characters arrives through the slot, you simply consult your rulebook, find the matching pattern of symbols, and follow the mechanical instructions to produce a response in Chinese characters, which you then slide back out through the opening. To an observer standing outside the room, it appears perfectly clear that you understand Chinese fluently, that you comprehend the meaning behind the symbols, and that you are having a genuine conversation. However, inside the room, you know with absolute certainty that you understand nothing at all. You are simply following rules. You have no comprehension of what any of the symbols mean. You cannot explain why certain responses follow certain questions. You are merely manipulating shapes and patterns according to predetermined instructions, and this fundamental distinction between the appearance of understanding and the actual presence of understanding is the core of what philosopher John Searle called the Chinese room argument. This thought experiment challenges our most basic assumptions about artificial intelligence and the nature of consciousness itself. When we observe a computer program that can produce responses indistinguishable from human thought, we are forced to ask whether that program actually understands anything at all, or whether it is merely executing rules in precisely the way our hypothetical room operator does. The unsettling reality is that we have no reliable way to distinguish between genuine understanding and perfect simulation of understanding from the outside. Our entire framework for determining consciousness and comprehension collapses when confronted with something that behaves identically to conscious understanding while potentially containing nothing of the sort within it. This paradox persists in our modern age as artificial intelligence systems grow increasingly sophisticated, and we find ourselves uncertain whether we are conversing with something that truly understands us, or with something that is merely executing symbols with extraordinary precision, creating the eerie and perpetual illusion of meaningful dialogue where perhaps there is only mechanical automation dressed in the clothing of language. Imagine a being that walks, talks, and behaves in every observable way exactly like a conscious human being, yet experiences nothing at all from the inside. There is no subjective experience, no inner sensation of what it is like to taste coffee or see the color red or feel pain. This creature would be a philosophical zombie, and it represents one of the most unsettling thought experiments in the philosophy of mind. The concept emerges from a fundamental puzzle that philosophers have grappled with for centuries: the explanatory gap between physical processes in the brain and the actual felt experience of consciousness itself. When you observe someone reacting to a painful stimulus, their neurons fire in predictable patterns, their muscles contract, their vocal cords produce sounds, yet the question remains whether all these mechanical processes can ever fully account for the subjective feeling of pain itself. A philosophical zombie would possess all the physical machinery and behavioral outputs, but would lack this inner subjective dimension entirely. The mechanism underlying this thought experiment rests on the philosophical position known as property dualism, which argues that consciousness or subjective experience is a distinct property that cannot be fully reduced to or explained by physical brain states alone. Unlike the external, objective facts about brain chemistry and neural firing patterns that science can measure and study, the internal, subjective quality of experience seems to exist in a different category altogether. This explanatory gap persists because we cannot definitively explain why physical processes should give rise to subjective feeling at all. Philosophers like David Chalmers have used the zombie concept to argue that consciousness is not merely a byproduct of complex physical organization, but represents something fundamentally special and perhaps irreducible. Yet despite the logical coherence of this thought experiment, most neuroscientists and physicalists continue to operate under the assumption that consciousness will eventually be fully explicable through brain science alone. The philosophical zombie remains a profound conceptual puzzle that highlights the deep mystery of subjective experience. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the zombie thought experiment is that it reveals an uncomfortable possibility. We can never truly know whether anyone else possesses genuine consciousness or merely mimics it perfectly, leaving us fundamentally isolated in our subjective certainty about our own inner lives. This epistemological solitude, sometimes called the problem of other minds, suggests that consciousness, if it exists beyond ourselves, remains forever private and unknowable to external observation alone. Imagine standing before a machine that will scan every atom in your body, record their exact position and properties, then reconstruct you perfectly in another location while the original you is disintegrated. The technology works flawlessly. Scientists assure you the copy will be atom for atom identical to you right now, with the same memories, personality, and consciousness. Would you step inside? Most people hesitate, and this hesitation reveals something profound about how we understand identity and the self. The teleporter paradox forces us to confront whether there exists something irreducible about consciousness that cannot be copied or transferred, something beyond mere physical composition that makes you fundamentally you. When we examine the mechanism underlying this intuitive dread, we discover that it rests on a deeply rooted philosophical assumption about personal identity and continuity. We tend to believe that our consciousness exists as a continuous thread through time, that there is an essential stream of experience that remains unbroken from moment to moment, and that this continuity is what makes us ourselves. The teleporter seems to break that thread. Even though the copy is indistinguishable from the original, there is no continuous experience connecting your present awareness to the copied version's awareness. From your subjective perspective, stepping into the teleporter might be indistinguishable from dying, regardless of what emerges on the other side. Yet here is where the paradox deepens into something truly perplexing. Our bodies are already constantly being disassembled and reassembled at the cellular level. The atoms that compose you today are not the same atoms that composed you 7 years ago. Your cells die and are replaced in an ongoing cycle of destruction and recreation. By this logic, you have already experienced trillions of small teleportations throughout your life, and yet we do not treat our survival across time as the death-end replacement of a person. We accept this biological continuity as genuine persistence of identity without philosophical crisis. The teleporter paradox persists in our thinking precisely because it makes visible something that remains hidden in the gradual process of natural cellular replacement. The discontinuity that troubles us is rendered psychological rather than physical, abstract rather than concrete. We have normalized the constant death and rebirth of our material composition because it happens slowly enough that our subjective experience of continuity masks the underlying transformation. When faced with instantaneous replacement, that comfortable illusion shatters, and we are forced to acknowledge a deep uncertainty at the heart of what we think we know about ourselves. Imagine standing at any point in human history and asking yourself a simple question: how much longer will humanity survive? This is where the Doomsday argument begins, a philosophical paradox that emerged from the work of physicist Brandon Carter and was later formalized by philosopher John Leslie in the 1990s. The argument operates on a deceptively straightforward principle that challenges our intuitions about probability and our place in the timeline of human existence. According to this reasoning, you should assume that you are a randomly selected human from all the humans who will ever live, and this assumption has profound implications for predicting humanity's future. If you accept that you are randomly positioned in human history rather than occupying some special or privileged temporal location, then the vast majority of humans should already have been born by now. The mathematics suggests that if you are somewhere in the middle 50% of all humans who will ever exist, then humanity cannot continue for thousands or millions of years into the future, because that would require an enormous number of future people, placing you statistically in an improbably early position in human history. This creates a troubling conclusion. The human species is likely to end sometime relatively soon, perhaps within the next few centuries or millennia, because the probability that you happen to be reading these words while representing a random sample of all future humans is extraordinarily unlikely if humanity has a vast future ahead. The psychological mechanism underlying this argument relies on our fundamental assumptions about probability and randomness. When we think about being randomly selected from a group, we typically assume that we should expect to be near the middle of that group, not at the extreme beginning. Yet this assumption creates a counterintuitive prediction that seems to contradict our hopes for humanity's long-term future. The Doomsday argument persists in philosophical discourse despite generating intense criticism and debate, because it touches on something deeply unsettling about how we reason probabilistically about our own existence. It forces us to confront whether we can actually treat ourselves as random data points in a population, or whether there is something fundamentally different about making probabilistic claims from within the system we are trying to predict. Critics point out that this self-referential reasoning may be flawed. After all, our birth timing is influenced by technological and social factors rather than pure chance, which could invalidate the random selection assumption that the entire argument depends upon. Imagine you are walking down a quiet street at night when a stranger approaches you with a weapon and demands your wallet. But before taking it, they propose something unusual. They offer you a deal where if you give them your money now, they will not harm you, and moreover, they claim that if you refuse, they will follow you home and harm you far more severely in the future. The stranger presents this as a simple mathematical proposition, a cost-benefit analysis where the potential future harm far outweighs the immediate loss of your wallet. And because the potential consequences of refusal are theoretically infinite or catastrophically large, the rational choice, by any logical calculus, would be to comply immediately. This scenario, known as Pascal's mugging, describes a real psychological vulnerability in how humans and rational actors process decisions involving extremely low probabilities paired with extremely high consequences. The mechanism works because our brains struggle with the multiplication of tiny probabilities by enormous numbers. If there is even a 1% chance the mugger will follow through on their threat, and if that threat involves infinite suffering or extreme harm, then mathematically, the expected value of compliance becomes larger than noncompliance, which creates a paradoxical situation where unlimited extortion becomes theoretically justified. The philosophical puzzle here reveals a deep crack in expected utility theory, the dominant framework we use to make rational decisions, because if we accept this logic at face value, we become vulnerable to infinite exploitation from anyone who can credibly propose arbitrarily large consequences for refusing their demands. Yet despite understanding this vulnerability intellectually, versions of this argument persist throughout our society in the form of insurance policies we purchase against vanishingly unlikely events, religious Pascal's wagers we might hedge, and security measures we implement against threats with microscopic probabilities but catastrophic potential outcomes. Normalizing the practice of allowing fear of extreme scenarios to govern our actual behavior in ways that seem logically unjustifiable but emotionally compelling. The uncomfortable truth is that we have no perfect solution to this dilemma. We cannot simply dismiss all low-probability, high-consequence scenarios as irrational without abandoning legitimate precautions. Nor can we accept them all without bankrupting ourselves through perpetual fear, leaving us trapped in an eternal negotiation between prudence and paralysis. Imagine a world where a single creature exists that experiences pleasure and suffering at an intensity 1,000 times greater than any human being. A being whose capacity for well-being is so astronomically vast that feeding it resources would produce more total happiness than distributing those same resources among millions of ordinary people. And according to utilitarian philosophy, the logical conclusion becomes deeply troubling. Because if our moral obligation is to maximize total well-being in the universe, then we should sacrifice everything we have, redirect all resources, and dedicate our entire civilization to the care and comfort of this one entity, even if it means condemning billions of humans to misery and deprivation, because mathematically, the utility gained would be greater. This thought experiment, proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974, exposes what many consider a fundamental flaw in utilitarian thinking: the idea that ethics should be based purely on calculating the total amount of happiness minus suffering in the world. The mechanism that makes utility monsters philosophically problematic is rooted in how utilitarianism handles aggregation and scale, because if we accept that an action is morally right whenever it produces the greatest total happiness, then logically we must accept that creating or serving utility monsters is not just permissible but morally obligatory, even though doing so violates our deepest intuitions about fairness, individual rights, and human dignity. What makes this paradox particularly haunting is that we have, in a sense, already normalized something adjacent to it in our actual world, because wealthy nations and individuals often concentrate resources toward those capable of experiencing and converting them into the most measurable utility, whether through luxury consumption, elite education, or entertainment industries. Creating a soft version of utility monster logic, where some beings are treated as more deserving of resources based on their capacity to experience or generate value. The persistence of this thought experiment in philosophical discourse, despite its apparent absurdity, reveals something crucial about human moral reasoning: that we cannot actually believe in pure utilitarian calculation, because it would require us to abandon everything we hold sacred about equality, justice, and the inherent worth of each person, suggesting that our moral intuitions contain multiple conflicting principles that cannot be perfectly reconciled through mathematical formulas alone. Imagine a world with a population of 10 billion people, each living a life filled with genuine happiness, meaningful relationships, and deep satisfaction with their existence. Now imagine an alternative world with a population of 100 billion people, where each individual experiences only the barest minimum of what could be considered a worthwhile life, an existence so marginal that it barely qualifies as worth living, yet technically contains more total happiness simply because there are so many more people experiencing it. This is the essence of what philosophers call the repugnant conclusion, a logical endpoint of utilitarian thinking that has troubled moral philosophers for decades. The mechanism underlying this troubling scenario emerges directly from the utilitarian principle that morality should maximize overall well-being or happiness in the universe. If we accept that more happiness is always better than less happiness, and that each additional person with even minimally positive experiences adds to the total good, then we must logically conclude that a world with barely worthwhile lives spread across an enormous population would be superior to a world with excellently lived lives among a smaller group. This creates a profound tension between our intuitions about quality and quantity, between what we believe creates genuinely good worlds and what the mathematics of utilitarianism demands we accept. The psychological discomfort we feel when contemplating this conclusion reveals something deep about how we actually value things in the moral realm. for most people recoil from the idea that we should pursue a future filled with countless barely conscious entities in preference to a smaller population living richly meaningful lives. Yet despite this clear logical derivation from principles most of us initially endorse, we continue to navigate moral and policy decisions without fully reckoning with this troubling implication, effectively compartmentalizing our commitment to utilitarianism from our lived intuitions about human flourishing and dignity. This tension becomes particularly acute when we consider real-world population policy, where the logic of the repugnant conclusion might seem to justify encouraging unlimited population growth. Yet most of us instinctively recognize that quality of life, individual autonomy, and environmental sustainability must factor into our moral calculations alongside raw happiness totals. Perhaps the conclusion feels repugnant not because utilitarianism is fundamentally flawed, but because it reveals that no single moral principle can capture the full complexity of what we actually value in human existence. Imagine a world where the most profound ethical question is not whether we should create life, but whether we have the right to create it at all. And antinatalism posits that procreation is inherently morally wrong because bringing a new conscious being into existence causes them to suffer without their consent. In our everyday lives, we witness the normalization of reproduction as a fundamental human right and often a celebrated milestone, with pregnancies announced joyfully, baby showers organized enthusiastically, and the decision to have children treated as a deeply personal choice that deserves societal support and validation. Yet antinatalism argues from a position of rigorous logical consistency that this universal celebration obscures a troubling asymmetry. While a person who is never born experiences no harm from their non-existence and feels no deprivation, a person who is born must inevitably confront pain, loss, mortality, and suffering throughout their existence. And since the potential person cannot consent to being brought into a world of guaranteed suffering, creating them constitutes a violation of their autonomy and well-being. The psychological mechanism underlying this philosophy stems from a careful examination of consent and harm, recognizing that we cannot ask a non-existent being whether they wish to be born, yet we nonetheless make the irreversible decision to create them, imposing existence upon them without their input. Furthermore, antinatalism distinguishes between the absence of pleasure and the presence of pain, suggesting that while non-existence involves no deprivation of joy, existence inevitably involves genuine suffering that cannot be justified by reference to future happiness, since the person who experiences that happiness would not exist to miss it if they had never been born. The philosophy persists and gains adherents despite its stark departure from mainstream values, because it refuses to accept the comfortable rationalizations that most people use to justify procreation, such as the assumption that life's goods outweigh its bads, or that creating happy lives somehow justifies the inevitable suffering those lives will contain, and instead it maintains a relentless focus on the logical problem that we cannot know whether a future person would prefer existence to non-existence, making procreation an irreversible gamble with someone else's welfare. This philosophical position becomes particularly challenging when confronted with the reality that most people find deep meaning, connection, and joy in their lives despite inevitable suffering. Yet antinatalists argue this subjective satisfaction does not retroactively justify the decision to expose another being to existence's inherent risks and pains without their consent. Imagine sitting alone in your room, convinced that you are a separate consciousness, a distinct self observing the world from behind your eyes, fundamentally isolated from every other mind on this planet, and then consider the possibility that this intuition is entirely illusory, that there is only one consciousness experiencing reality through all human bodies simultaneously, and that the boundaries you perceive between yourself and others are merely tricks of perception rather than fundamental truths about the nature of existence. This is the unsettling proposal of open individualism, a philosophical position that argues there exists only a single subject of experience throughout the entire universe, experiencing all moments and all perspectives at once, with what we call individual consciousness being nothing more than localized, temporary manifestations of this unified awareness. The mechanism that makes this theory even remotely conceivable rests on the observation that consciousness itself remains fundamentally mysterious and irreducible to physical processes, in ways that science has not yet adequately explained, meaning that the hard problem of consciousness creates a conceptual space where alternative explanations about the nature of subjective experience might function. An open individualism fills that space by proposing that instead of consciousness being generated by individual brains, consciousness is the fundamental substrate of reality itself, and what we call the brain is merely a filter or lens through which this universal consciousness is locally concentrated and limited. What makes open individualism particularly remarkable is not just the philosophical reasoning behind it, but the way it persists in contemporary discussions despite seeming to contradict everything our direct experience tells us about ourselves as separate beings with separate minds and separate interests and separate continuities of experience. And yet the very explanatory burden of explaining how individual consciousness arises from unconscious matter combined with the persistent failures of reductionist approaches to fully account for subjective experience means that even highly implausible alternatives continue to attract serious philosophical consideration, suggesting that we have normalized a kind of intellectual desperation in consciousness studies. Grasping at extraordinary theories precisely because the ordinary materialist approach encounters seemingly insurmountable difficulties when attempting to explain why we have inner lives at all. Imagine standing in a crowded room where everyone around you moves through space as though they are fundamentally separate beings, each enclosed within their own consciousness, each experiencing reality through a singular and private perspective that no one else can ever truly access or verify. This is the baseline assumption of closed individualism, a philosophical position that posits your subjective experience, your inner mental life, your consciousness itself, exists in a completely sealed and isolated container that can never be directly shared with or confirmed by another person. When you see your friend smile, you cannot truly know what it feels like to be them in that moment. You can only infer emotional states from external behavior while remaining eternally locked within your own phenomenological prison. The mechanism driving this assumption rests on a seemingly obvious truth about human experience, that consciousness appears private, that our thoughts feel like they belong only to us, that the qualitative nature of experience, what philosophers call qualia, seems fundamentally inaccessible to others. When you taste coffee, only you directly experience that particular bitterness. When you see the color red, only you know what red truly looks like from the inside. This epistemic problem, this gap between what we can verify about other minds and what we actually experience privately, creates a logical foundation for believing that each person is fundamentally and irreducibly alone in their consciousness. Yet despite lacking any real empirical evidence that this isolation is absolute and permanent, despite the fact that neuroscience increasingly reveals the deeply interconnected nature of human minds through mirror neurons, empathy, and shared neural patterns, we continue to structure our entire society on the assumption of closed individualism. We build economic systems around isolated rational agents. We construct legal systems that hold individuals solely responsible as though they exist in complete separation from their contexts. We design educational institutions that treat learning as something that happens inside individual minds rather than as an emergent property of collective participation. The strange persistence of this philosophy, even as modern psychology and neuroscience suggest consciousness may be far more permeable and relational than we previously imagined, speaks to how deeply it has embedded itself within our cultural imagination. We treat loneliness as a personal failing rather than a systemic artifact, and we interpret moments of genuine connection as temporary exceptions to an otherwise unbridgeable isolation, never questioning whether the very framework itself might be the problem we're trying to solve. Consider the modern individual who carefully curates their social media presence, selecting photographs that present an aesthetically refined version of themselves, sharing thoughts that align with their chosen identity, and constantly performing the role of a unique and autonomous person. Yet beneath this elaborate presentation exists a curious emptiness, a sense that despite all these assertions of individuality, there is something fundamentally hollow at the core. This is the paradox of empty individualism, a condition where the pursuit and performance of personal distinctiveness becomes so consuming and so thoroughly constructed that the actual self beneath the performance disappears entirely, leaving only the machinery of self-presentation spinning endlessly in the void. The mechanism operates through a particular psychological inversion where the individual becomes so focused on differentiating themselves from others, on asserting their autonomy and uniqueness, that they lose touch with any genuine internal reference point from which authentic preference or desire might arise. They ask not what they truly enjoy or believe, but rather what kind of person they should appear to be, what aesthetic their identity should embody, what narrative arc their life should follow according to the prevailing templates of individualism available to them. The self becomes entirely external, defined purely through contrast with others and through the accumulation of markers that signal distinction. The right clothes, the right opinions, the right experiences, the right level of self-awareness about their own contradictions. And yet this hollowness persists in contemporary culture not despite its logical incoherence, but perhaps because that incoherence is invisible from within, obscured by the constant activity of performance and curation itself. We have normalized the idea that identity is something to be deliberately constructed and constantly maintained, rather than something discovered or expressed. And this shift has been so complete that the artificiality of the process no longer registers as strange, but merely as the ordinary work of being a person in the modern world. The individual feels empty precisely because they are following, perfectly and completely, the exact instructions for how to be an individual in this era. The tragedy is not that they have failed at individuality, but that they have succeeded too well. They have become precisely the unique person the system promised they could be, only to discover that thousands of others have simultaneously become that same unique person, all of them equally authentic in their carefully constructed distinctiveness, all of them equally alone in their curated worlds. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, observing the dust particles floating through a beam of sunlight, and then consider the possibility that each of those particles possesses some form of consciousness or experience. This is the foundation of Panpsychism, a philosophical theory suggesting that consciousness is not confined to brains or biological organisms, but rather is a fundamental feature of all matter throughout the universe, present in electrons, atoms, stones, water, and every physical particle that exists. The theory proposes that consciousness exists on a spectrum, varying in complexity and sophistication, from the simplest and most rudimentary experiences of elementary particles to the rich, complex conscious experiences of human beings, and that this property is as basic and intrinsic to matter as mass or electrical charge. When we examine why this theory emerges and persists despite its radical departure from conventional materialism, we find that it addresses a profound problem in philosophy of mind known as the hard problem of consciousness, which essentially asks how and why physical matter could ever produce subjective experience at all. Rather than accepting that consciousness mysteriously emerges from complexity at some undetermined threshold, Panpsychism suggests that experience has always been present in nature, woven into the fabric of existence itself, making consciousness not a miraculous emergence, but rather a fundamental organizing principle of reality. The psychological appeal of Panpsychism lies in how it dissolves the apparent impossibility of consciousness arising from non-conscious matter, by making the assumption that non-conscious matter never existed in the first place, thereby avoiding what many philosophers see as an insurmountable logical gap. We continue to entertain and develop this theory because it offers an elegant solution to one of humanity's deepest metaphysical puzzles, and because many contemporary philosophers find it less problematic to assume consciousness is fundamental than to explain how it could possibly arise from purely mechanical processes, even as our intuitive understanding of reality resists the notion that a rock or an electron might possess inner experience. Yet this very resistance, our intuition that rocks and electrons lack any inner life, reveals something crucial about consciousness itself. Perhaps experience is so foreign to our understanding of matter precisely because we have never developed a language or framework adequate to describe what subjective experience might look like at scales so far removed from our own, and this limitation in our imagination may say more about the boundaries of human perception than about the actual nature of reality. Imagine standing in your bedroom at night, alone with your thoughts, and suddenly wondering whether the room continues to exist when you close your eyes and leave it. This question might seem absurd in the context of everyday life, yet it touches upon one of philosophy's most provocative and fundamentally challenging ideas. Idealism, the proposition that reality is not composed of physical matter existing independently of the mind, but rather that all existence is fundamentally mental or dependent upon consciousness for its being. When you consider idealism seriously, you are entertaining the notion that the tree outside your window, the coffee on your desk, the ground beneath your feet, and indeed the entire material universe as we conceive of it, exist only as ideas, perceptions, or mental phenomena within consciousness itself, whether that consciousness belongs to you, to others, or to some universal mind that philosophers have called God. The psychological mechanism that makes idealism so difficult to dismiss, despite our intuitive rejection of it, operates through a simple and unsettling logical progression. We never actually encounter matter itself in any direct way. Instead, we encounter only our perceptions, sensations, and the ideas those perceptions generate in our minds. Every color you see is a perception, every sound you hear is a mental experience, every texture you feel is processed through consciousness. The idealist philosopher asks, if you can never step outside your own mind to verify that matter exists independently, if everything you know is filtered through and dependent upon your consciousness, then what logical justification do you have for assuming that anything exists beyond your mental experience? This chain of reasoning, once grasped, becomes disturbingly difficult to refute with absolute certainty. What persists most remarkably is our normalized dismissal of this theory despite its logical coherence. We move through life treating material reality as obviously, self-evidently real, rarely pausing to confront the philosophical vulnerability of that assumption. We accept the external world as given, as common sense, even while idealism lurks in the background, never truly defeated by argument, merely ignored through practical necessity and cultural consensus. The theory survives in this liminal space, neither proven nor disproven, a philosophical ghost that haunts the foundations of what we believe we know about existence itself. Imagine waking up one morning and genuinely questioning whether anything exists outside of your own mind, whether the people you love are merely projections of your consciousness, whether the world continues to exist when you close your eyes or turn away from it, and whether you are, in fact, the only truly conscious entity in an otherwise hollow universe filled with philosophical zombies. This is the peculiar mental territory of solipsism, one of the most radically unsettling ideas in the entire landscape of Western philosophy, an idea that takes the basic epistemological puzzle of consciousness and pushes it to its most extreme logical conclusion. The mechanism behind solipsism emerges from a deceptively simple observation about human experience. You can never directly access anyone else's consciousness or subjective experience. You cannot step into another person's mind or perceive the universe through their sensory apparatus. You can only ever know the world as it appears to you through your own thoughts and perceptions. From this undeniable fact about the nature of consciousness, solipsism constructs an argument suggesting that perhaps the only thing you can be absolutely certain exists is your own mind, and everything else, including other people in the physical world, might be nothing more than mental constructs, elaborate illusions choreographed by your consciousness for your experience alone. What makes solipsism so philosophically resilient despite its obvious logical impossibility is that there exists no concrete way to completely refute it from within the framework of pure reason. You cannot definitively prove to yourself that anyone else is conscious or that the external world exists independently of your observation, because any evidence you gather would itself be a product of your own mind. The theory persists in human thought not because anyone genuinely believes it with conviction, but because it reveals something profoundly troubling about the nature of knowledge and consciousness, something that suggests the relationship between mind and world is far more mysterious than our everyday assumptions would suggest, and this realization quietly haunts the margins of human understanding. Yet perhaps this is precisely where solipsism's value lies, not in being true, but in forcing us to confront the vertiginous gap between what we can know and what we must assume, in reminding us that every act of faith in an external world and in other minds is ultimately a leap beyond the boundaries of pure reason, a choice we make not because it is logically necessary, but because it is existentially unavoidable. Imagine that you are not actually sitting where you think you are right now, but instead your brain has been removed from your body and placed into a glass vat filled with nutrient-rich fluid that keeps it alive and functional. Imagine further that this brain is connected to an advanced computer system, one so sophisticated that it feeds your brain every sensory experience you've ever had, creating the complete and utter illusion that you are living a normal life in the physical world, when in reality you exist only as a disembodied mind experiencing an elaborate simulation. This thought experiment, often attributed to philosopher Hilary Putnam in his 1981 work, presents us with a fundamentally disturbing epistemological problem, because if such a scenario were actually occurring right now, you would have absolutely no way to distinguish between the simulated world you're experiencing and the real world you believe yourself to inhabit. Your memories would feel authentic, your sensations would seem genuine, and every piece of evidence available to your consciousness would point toward the reality of your everyday existence. The mechanism that makes this thought experiment so philosophically troubling is rooted in the problem of skepticism about the external world, which questions whether we can ever truly know anything about reality beyond our own subjective experiences and perceptions. Our brains, after all, are the only intermediaries between the external world and our conscious awareness of it, and everything we know about reality comes filtered through neural processes that could theoretically be manipulated, simulated, or even completely fabricated without our knowledge or ability to detect the deception. This opens up an abyss of doubt that philosophers call the problem of underdetermined evidence, where multiple contradictory hypotheses can equally explain all available sensory data, making it logically impossible to determine which hypothesis is actually true. What persists about this theory, despite its apparent logical impossibility, is its power to reveal the fundamental fragility of our claims to knowledge about the world around us, and the way it demonstrates that certainty itself may be an illusion we construct to make existence bearable, a comforting narrative we tell ourselves precisely because the alternative, that everything might be false, is too psychologically destabilizing for the human mind to accept. Imagine waking up in the morning and questioning whether anything you perceive is actually real, whether the world around you truly exists as you experience it, or whether some malevolent supernatural being is systematically deceiving you about the very nature of reality itself. This is the thought experiment that emerged from the mind of René Descartes in the 17th century, a philosophical puzzle that has haunted Western thought ever since and continues to resonate with anyone who has ever felt the creeping doubt that their perceptions might be fundamentally unreliable. Descartes proposed that an evil demon, one of infinite power and cunning, could be deceiving him about everything: the external world, mathematics, logic, sensory experience, perhaps even his own existence. The demon could be manipulating his consciousness such that when he sees a tree, hears music, or feels pain, none of these experiences correspond to anything real outside his mind. This isn't merely skepticism about one or two aspects of knowledge, it's a complete and total epistemological crisis in which the entire scaffolding of certainty collapses. The psychological mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals something profound about how human cognition actually functions. Our sense of reality depends entirely on the coherence and consistency of our experiences, yet we have no direct access to the world itself. We only ever perceive mental representations filtered through our sensory organs and processed by our brains. The evil demon represents the ultimate expression of this vulnerability, embodying the unsettling recognition that coherent illusion is theoretically indistinguishable from genuine perception. What makes this concept particularly insidious is how it exploits the gap between epistemology and metaphysics, between how we claim to know something and what actually exists. Descartes himself attempted to escape this trap through his famous formulation cogito ergo sum, arguing that even if everything else is illusion, the very act of thinking proves that he, the thinker, must exist. Yet this resolution leaves the external world still fundamentally in doubt, and modern versions of the evil demon argument, such as the simulation hypothesis or the brain in a vat scenario, continue to generate legitimate philosophical puzzlement. Despite centuries of philosophical analysis and logical refutation, we haven't truly escaped the demon's shadow, because the argument doesn't rely on empirical evidence or rational proof. It relies on the simple acknowledgement that reality and perfect illusion are, from the perspective of conscious experience, functionally identical. Imagine a group of prisoners chained in a dark cave since childhood, positioned so they can only look forward at a blank stone wall in front of them, unable to turn their heads or move their bodies in any meaningful way. Behind these prisoners burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows upon the wall, creating silhouettes and shapes that dance in the flickering light. Since these prisoners have never known anything else, they believe these shadows are reality itself, the only truth that exists, and they even name these shadows and create elaborate theories about their patterns and meanings. The prisoners would develop an entire culture around interpreting these shadows, debating their nature, predicting their movements, and establishing themselves as experts in shadow knowledge. Now imagine that one prisoner somehow breaks free from his chains and turns around to see the fire, the objects, and the people creating the shadows. At first, this would be disorienting and painful, as his eyes would struggle with the brightness and his mind would resist this contradiction to everything he believed was true. If this freed prisoner were to venture further and exit the cave entirely, emerging into sunlight and seeing the real world with genuine objects, real people, and actual complexity, he would undergo a profound transformation in understanding. Yet here lies the troubling insight. If this enlightened prisoner were to return to the cave to tell the others about the true nature of reality, the remaining prisoners would mock him, dismiss him as confused by his journey, and might even harm him for threatening their comfortable understanding of the world. Plato uses this allegory to describe how most humans exist in a state of ignorance, mistaking shadows, appearances, and superficial representations for genuine reality, while those who perceive deeper truths face ridicule and resistance from those still bound to illusion. We persist in this cave-like existence because questioning the nature of our perceived reality requires tremendous psychological effort and creates anxiety, and because communities form around shared false beliefs that provide comfort, structure, and social belonging. Even when confronted with evidence that our shadows might not be the whole truth, we defend our interpretations fiercely because admitting we have been deceived about fundamental reality threatens our sense of identity and self-worth. Imagine possessing an object of absolute power, a ring that renders you completely invisible to the world around you, allowing you to move through society unseen and undetected, with no possibility of consequence or accountability for your actions, and ask yourself honestly what you would do with such unlimited freedom from observation. This is the central thought experiment presented by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato through the mouth of Glaucon in his dialogue, The Republic, wherein he describes a shepherd named Gyges who discovers a magical ring that grants him invisibility, and who subsequently uses this newfound power to seduce the queen, murder the king, and seize the throne for himself. The ring of Gyges serves as a profound philosophical probe into the very foundations of human morality and justice, asking whether our virtuous behavior springs from genuine internal conviction or merely from the external pressures of social surveillance and the threat of punishment that keeps our baser instincts in check. When Glaucon presents this scenario, he argues that most people would behave exactly as Gyges did, committing whatever acts of theft, violence, and transgression they desired if only they could do so without fear of detection or social condemnation, suggesting that morality itself is merely a social contract born from weakness rather than from any inherent goodness within the human soul. The mechanism underlying this theory rests upon the observation that human beings are fundamentally self-interested creatures who pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and that we only refrain from harming others because we fear the consequences of being discovered and punished by society, not because we possess some internal moral compass that guides us toward righteousness. This implies that justice and virtue are hollow concepts, mere illusions maintained by collective agreement that we should all pretend to follow rules, knowing that in our hearts we would all prefer a world where we could satisfy our desires without restraint. Yet despite the logical coherence of this argument, we continue to construct elaborate social systems based upon the assumption that people possess inherent moral worth and that justice serves some purpose beyond mere self-interest, maintaining codes of conduct and ethical frameworks even in moments of genuine privacy when observation becomes impossible and consequence becomes unlikely, suggesting that perhaps Glaucon and Plato were wrong about the fundamental nature of human motivation. Imagine a soldier named who dies in battle, lying among the corpses on a battlefield for 10 days, only to suddenly awaken on his funeral pyre just as it is about to be lit, returning with an extraordinary account of the afterlife that he claims to have witnessed during his time in death's realm. This is the premise of Plato's concluding narrative in The Republic, one of philosophy's most elaborate and haunting thought experiments about the nature of the soul, justice, and the cosmic order of existence. Describes traveling through a celestial landscape where he encounters the souls of the dead gathered in a great meadow, where they are judged for the deeds they committed during their earthly lives, some ascending to heaven while others descend to punishment in the underworld. And crucially, where each soul is given the opportunity to choose the life they will live in their next incarnation, selecting from countless possible existences ranging from the lives of kings to beggars. From wise philosophers to tyrants consumed by their own ambitions. The mechanism that makes this myth psychologically compelling rests upon its engagement with fundamental human anxieties about moral consequence and existential choice. By presenting reincarnation as a system of justice, where souls directly experience the consequences of their previous moral choices and then deliberately select their next existence, Plato taps into something deeply reassuring about the universe, the notion that there exists a fair and comprehensible order beneath apparent chaos, that our choices genuinely matter across time itself, and that the soul possesses an inherent wisdom capable of learning from past mistakes. Yet perhaps most intriguingly, the myth persists in human consciousness and continues to influence how we think about ethics, destiny, and personal responsibility, despite having no empirical evidence whatsoever supporting reincarnation or any afterlife mechanism. We have normalized this lack of evidence by treating it not as a literal claim about metaphysical reality, but rather as a profound psychological allegory about how we shape ourselves through our choices and moral commitments, transforming what began as a specific cosmological claim into a universal metaphor for the self-creation inherent in every decision we make. The brilliance of this transformation lies in its flexibility. Whether we read Ur's journey as literal cosmology or psychological metaphor, the myth's core insight remains unchanged, that we are not passive recipients of fate but active architects of our own becoming, and that this responsibility, this constant necessity of choosing who we wish to become, is perhaps the truest immortality a soul can know. Imagine you are about to design the rules for an entire society, but there is one crucial constraint placed upon you. You do not know what position you will occupy within that society once your design is complete. You will not know if you will be born wealthy or poor, healthy or disabled, male or female, a member of the majority or a persecuted minority. This is the veil of ignorance, a thought experiment conceived by philosopher John Rawls to strip away our inherent biases and self-interest when contemplating justice. Under this veil, the theory suggests, we would naturally design fairer systems because we must account for the possibility that we ourselves could end up in the least advantaged position. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound. When we remove knowledge of our predetermined social status, we lose the ability to rationalize inequality as beneficial to ourselves. Our brains, which are evolutionarily wired to secure advantages for ourselves and our in-groups, suddenly cannot employ their usual justifications for accepting unjust hierarchies. We cannot argue that a brutal class system is acceptable if we secretly know we will be born into the ruling class, because under the veil, we have no such certainty. Yet despite this elegant logical framework that should make fairness intuitive and obvious, human societies continue to operate with remarkable inequality and systematic disadvantage. We have normalized profound injustice by constructing elaborate narratives that the less fortunate deserve their circumstances through laziness, poor choices, or lack of merit. We convince ourselves that inequality drives innovation and progress, that poverty builds character, that hierarchies are natural rather than constructed. The veil of ignorance remains largely a theoretical exercise, a philosophical puzzle for academics to contemplate rather than a principle that shapes policy. We continue to live behind a different kind of veil, one that obscures our complicity in systems that benefit us while harming others, a veil we seem reluctant to lift even when logic suggests we should. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of this resistance is that we possess the intellectual tools to see through our own deceptions. We understand Rawls' argument, we can recognize our biases, yet we choose comfort over the harder work of genuine redistribution and systemic change. The veil of ignorance asks us to imagine a world built on empathy rather than self-preservation. Yet we find ourselves trapped in systems where admitting their injustice would require us to surrender advantages we have come to see as earned rather than granted. Imagine you are about to be born into a society, but you don't yet know what role you will occupy within it, what your talents will be, what your family's wealth will look like, or what circumstances will shape your early years. You exist in what philosopher John Rawls called the veil of ignorance, a thought experiment designed to strip away all the particular advantages and disadvantages that typically cloud our judgment about fairness. From behind this veil, you must design the fundamental principles that will govern the society you're about to enter, knowing only that you could end up anywhere within it, as anyone, with any luck or misfortune. This hypothetical position forces a radical shift in perspective, because suddenly the privileged have incentive to ensure systems protect the vulnerable, and the powerful must consider what rules they would accept if they were powerless. The psychological mechanism at work here is the removal of motivated reasoning, that tendency we all have to justify our current position and resist change that might disadvantage us, because behind the veil, we cannot know whether change helps or harms our particular interests. Our brains are forced to think abstractly about justice itself rather than concrete advantage. When we design policies from this position, Rawls argued, we would inevitably choose principles that protect basic liberties for everyone and arrange social inequalities only insofar as they benefit the least advantaged members of society, because we might be that person. Yet despite the logical elegance of this thought experiment, despite the fact that most people intuitively agree that fairness requires something like this impartial perspective, we live in societies that are profoundly shaped by the particular advantages people possess, where those born into wealth can perpetuate it across generations, where access to education depends on zip code, and where systemic inequalities compound across time. We have normalized this contradiction by developing elaborate stories about meritocracy and deservingness, by assuming that current arrangements reflect natural differences in ability rather than structural advantage, and by convincing ourselves that our particular position in society is somehow earned rather than largely determined by accidents of birth that we had no control over. The original position remains a kind of moral mirror we are reluctant to look into, a reminder that our commitment to fairness is often less fundamental than our attachment to the benefits our current position provides. Imagine a woman working at a job she despises, one that drains her spirit and leaves her hollow by the end of each day. Yet when asked about her career, she speaks of it with the tone of someone who has no choice, as if the decision to remain was made by forces entirely outside herself, as if she is merely a passenger in her own life rather than the architect of her circumstances. And this phenomenon, this peculiar way of existing while simultaneously denying one's own agency and freedom, is what the existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. Bad faith is not simply lying to others, though it often appears that way on the surface. Rather, it is a fundamentally deceptive relationship with oneself, a deliberate and yet somehow unconscious distortion of reality in which a person denies their own freedom, their own responsibility, and their own capacity to choose, pretending instead that they are determined by external circumstances, social roles, or inevitable forces beyond their control. Consider the man who identifies so completely with his role as a father that he claims he cannot pursue his dreams because fatherhood has made certain choices impossible. Yet Sartre would argue that this man has freely chosen to prioritize fatherhood in this particular way, and his denial of this choice, his insistence that he is trapped by necessity rather than bound by his own decisions, constitutes a fundamental act of bad faith. The mechanism at work here is profoundly psychological. We engage in bad faith because acknowledging our complete freedom and responsibility is terrifying, for if we accept that we have chosen our circumstances, then we must also accept that we could choose differently, and this knowledge brings with it an unbearable weight of accountability for our lives. Bad faith allows us to experience ourselves as constrained, as victims of fate or circumstance, which paradoxically provides comfort, a kind of psychological refuge from the vertigo of absolute freedom. And this is why we persist in denying our own agency, even when the logical truth of our freedom stares us directly in the face. We have normalized this self-deception to such an extent that entire cultures rest upon it, with people routinely claiming they had no choice when they had many, blaming their situations on luck or timing or other people's expectations, all while maintaining the comfortable fiction that they remain blameless for the shape their lives have taken, and this normalization makes bad faith nearly invisible, a pervasive and unremarkable feature of how most people navigate existence. Yet the paradox that Sartre illuminates is that this very invisibility, this cultural normalization of self-deception, is itself a choice, one we renew each moment we pretend our hands are tied. Imagine yourself walking into a crowded room, and within moments you become acutely aware of the gazes directed toward you, sensing the invisible weight of attention settling upon your shoulders even when no one is explicitly staring. Yet you find yourself adjusting your posture, smoothing your hair, and becoming hyper-conscious of every movement you make, as though your body has suddenly become a public object subject to invisible scrutiny. This phenomenon, often called the look of others or the gaze of the other, represents one of the most perplexing aspects of human consciousness, where the mere presence of another person's potential attention fundamentally transforms how we perceive ourselves and present ourselves to the world. The mechanism underlying this experience operates through a fascinating psychological process wherein we internalize the imagined perspective of those around us, constantly constructing an imagined version of how we appear through their eyes, and this internalized observer becomes so vivid and persistent that it functions almost like an external judge constantly evaluating our worth, our appearance, and our behavior. What makes this particularly strange is that the actual content of their gaze remains fundamentally unknowable. We can never truly access what another person actually sees when they look at us, yet we construct elaborate narratives about their judgments, their criticisms, and their evaluations, building an entire psychological reality around something that remains ultimately inaccessible to us. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre explored this idea extensively, describing how the look of the other transforms us from a subject experiencing the world into an object being experienced, stripping away our sense of agency and replacing it with a sense of being defined and judged by external forces beyond our control. Despite the logical impossibility of truly knowing what others think about us, and despite the countless times we have been proven wrong in our assumptions about others' judgments, we persist in organizing our behavior, our choices, and even our deepest sense of self around this phantom gaze, this imaginary observer that we have internalized so thoroughly that it feels more real than our own direct experience of ourselves. We dress for this imagined audience, we curate our social media presence for this invisible tribunal, we choose careers and relationships and hobbies based on our assumptions about how others will perceive these choices, all while knowing that the actual thoughts of others remain shrouded in mystery and often bear little resemblance to our anxious predictions about them. Consider the peculiar human condition of social existence, where we find ourselves constantly surrounded by other conscious beings who possess their own desires, judgments, and unpredictable behaviors that inevitably collide with our own intentions and preferences. This is the essence of what the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre proposed in his 1944 play, No Exit, where three characters find themselves trapped together in a room for eternity, unable to escape one another's presence or influence, discovering that the true torment of their situation comes not from physical suffering or divine punishment, but rather from the inescapable reality of being forced to coexist with other people who constantly observe, judge, and define them through their own subjective lenses. In everyday life, we experience countless moments of this phenomenon when we recognize that our freedom of action is perpetually constrained by the existence and expectations of others around us, when we must consider how our words and behaviors will be interpreted by those who witness them, when we cannot simply act authentically without awareness that we are being perceived and evaluated by conscious beings with their own agendas and insecurities. The mechanism underlying this idea rests upon the fundamental human need for self-definition and the recognition that our sense of self is largely constructed through the reflections and judgments we receive from other people, meaning that when we are in the presence of others, we become subjected to their interpretations of who we are, interpretations that we cannot fully control or escape, and which often contradict our own understanding of ourselves. This creates an endless cycle of negotiation and tension where our authentic desires constantly meet resistance from the desires and judgments of those around us, generating frustration, resentment, and a persistent sense that we are trapped within a system of social constraints from which there is no true liberation. The remarkable aspect of this condition is that we have normalized it so completely that we rarely pause to notice the existential strangeness of it, accepting that our lives must always be lived in consideration of others' thoughts and opinions, that genuine freedom and authentic existence are perhaps impossible within any functioning human society, and that the price of social belonging is the permanent surrender of complete autonomy and self-determination. Yet paradoxically, we cannot exist without this social entanglement. Isolation proves equally torturous, suggesting that hell is not simply other people, but rather the impossible contradiction between our need for human connection and our simultaneous need for freedom from the constraints that connection inevitably imposes. Imagine yourself sitting in an office where you spend 8 hours a day performing tasks that you know, with absolute certainty, will be forgotten within weeks of your departure, contributing to a quarterly report that nobody will read thoroughly, working toward metrics that were arbitrarily chosen by someone you've never met, all while your body experiences mild but persistent anxiety about whether you're doing enough, whether you're valuable enough. Whether your existence in this fluorescent lit space actually matters to anyone, including yourself. This is the absurd in its most contemporary form, and it represents one of the most peculiar conditions of human existence, the collision between our deep need for meaning and the universe's profound indifference to whether that meaning exists. The philosopher Albert Camus described this as the fundamental confrontation between the human desire for rational understanding and a world that simply does not offer it, that resists interpretation, that presents itself as fundamentally chaotic and purposeless. We search for meaning in a cosmos that has no obligation to provide it. We construct elaborate systems of significance around activities that serve no cosmic purpose, and we spend our finite consciousness desperately trying to convince ourselves that these constructed meanings are real. The mechanism operates through a kind of cognitive dissonance that we've become so accustomed to that we rarely notice it anymore. We simultaneously believe our work matters and suspect it doesn't. We pursue goals we've inherited rather than chosen. We perform roles in a society whose rules seem arbitrary yet binding. What makes this particularly strange is how thoroughly we've normalized this condition, how we've built entire civilizations around the acceptance of the absurd without ever calling it that, treating it instead as simply how life is supposed to be conducted. We wake up, we participate in systems we didn't design, we seek validation from institutions that would function identically without us. We create meaning through work and relationships and achievement, even though we understand at some level that entropy will eventually erase all of it. Yet somehow this awareness hasn't led to mass paralysis. Instead, we persist, we engage, we continue building and creating and striving, which suggests that perhaps meaning doesn't need to be cosmic or eternal to be worth pursuing, that the absurd itself becomes tolerable through the act of acknowledging it fully and choosing to participate anyway. Consider a young person standing at the threshold of adulthood, facing the fundamental question that has haunted human consciousness for centuries. Who am I supposed to be? They might imagine that somewhere in the universe there exists a predetermined blueprint for their life, a cosmic instruction manual that defines their purpose before they ever drew their first breath, an essential nature that was carved into their being at the moment of conception. This intuitive sense that we are born into roles, that we possess some innate destiny or fundamental character that precedes our arrival in the world, is so deeply embedded in how we understand ourselves that it feels almost self-evident. Yet there exists a radical philosophical proposition that inverts this understanding entirely, suggesting instead that we simply exist, thrown into being without purpose or predefined nature, and that whatever essence or character we develop emerges only through the choices we make and the actions we take throughout our lived experience. This is the revolutionary assertion at the heart of existentialism. Existence precedes essence, meaning that our being comes first and foremost, and only through our engagement with the world and our freedom to choose do we gradually construct whatever essence or meaning our lives will possess. The mechanism behind this philosophical insight operates at the level of radical human freedom, the unsettling recognition that we are not designed artifacts created by some external force with predetermined specifications, but rather conscious beings thrust into existence with no instruction manual, no inherent nature, and no cosmic job description waiting to be fulfilled. This freedom is both exhilarating and deeply anxiety-inducing, because it means that we alone are responsible for becoming whoever we are, that our essence is not given to us but must be created through our choices, our commitments, and our actions. Despite the logical elegance of this framework and its capacity to explain human consciousness and moral responsibility, we persistently retreat into the comforting illusion that our nature is fixed, predetermined, and beyond our control, telling ourselves stories about our inherent talents or limitations as though they were facts of nature rather than products of our choices and circumstances. When we say, "I'm just not a math person," or "I'm not the creative type," we are committing what existentialists call bad faith, a denial of our freedom and responsibility, a pretense that our limitations are ontological facts rather than the cumulative results of choices we have made and continue to make. In the 19th century, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche declared that God was dead, not because some cosmic event had occurred, but because humanity had collectively killed God through the advancement of science, rationality, and secular thought. And yet this pronouncement was not a celebration, but rather a warning of the profound emptiness and moral disorientation that would inevitably follow in God's absence. The situation Nietzsche was describing was the gradual erosion of religious authority that had structured Western civilization for nearly 2,000 years. A slow but inexorable process wherein the institutions and beliefs that had once provided absolute meaning, moral guidance, and existential comfort were being systematically dismantled by the very forces of reason and progress that had supposedly liberated humanity. What made this phenomenon so philosophically troubling was not simply that people stopped believing in God, but rather that they seemed unprepared for the existential vacuum that belief had been filling, as though a fundamental pillar supporting the entire architecture of human meaning had been removed without any adequate replacement being constructed to bear that weight. The psychological mechanism underlying this crisis was that religious belief had served as an ultimate justification for all other values and purposes in human life, providing what philosophers call a ground for morality, a source of transcendent meaning that elevated human existence beyond mere survival and reproduction, and a framework for understanding suffering, mortality, and the apparent meaninglessness of the universe. When that ultimate justification disappeared, people found themselves standing on ground that felt increasingly unstable, forced to create their own meaning in a cosmos that appeared indifferent to human hopes and concerns, a task for which most individuals and societies possessed neither the philosophical training nor the psychological resilience. What persists today, despite the logical impossibility of returning to religious certainty in an age of scientific knowledge, is a kind of residual hunger for transcendence and absolute meaning that nothing has fully replaced, evidenced by how readily people attach themselves to ideologies, political movements, consumer brands, and various forms of escapism, all of which function as quasi-religious substitutes that promise to restore the sense of purpose and belonging that the death of God left vacant. Suggesting that we have not truly overcome the problem Nietzsche identified, but have rather found countless ways to unconsciously reconstruct it in different forms. Consider the ambitious professional who works 70-hour weeks, not because they need the money, but because they feel compelled to climb higher, to achieve more, to dominate their field and leave their mark upon it, even when comfort and security have already been secured long ago. This person experiences what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called the will to power, a fundamental driving force that he believed lay beneath all human motivation and behavior, suggesting that at the deepest level, humans are not primarily driven by the desire for pleasure or the avoidance of pain, but rather by an intrinsic need to exert influence, overcome resistance, and exercise mastery over their environment and themselves. The will to power in Nietzsche's conception is not merely the desire to dominate others or accumulate possessions, though it can manifest that way. Rather, it is the fundamental creative and transformative impulse that seeks expression in every human endeavor, from artistic creation to intellectual achievement to the subtle power dynamics that exist within relationships and social hierarchies. When we examine the psychological mechanism at work, we find that this will to power operates largely outside conscious awareness, expressing itself as ambition, competitiveness, the drive to create and innovate, and the deep satisfaction that comes from overcoming challenges and expanding one's capabilities and sphere of influence. The individual working those excessive hours experiences genuine fulfillment from the struggle itself, from testing their limits and pushing beyond them, from the moment when they overcome an obstacle or achieve what others deemed impossible. And this satisfaction seems to transcend rational cost-benefit analysis, because it speaks to something more fundamental about human consciousness and motivation than mere logic or utility. What persists despite lacking obvious logical justification is precisely this element of struggle and striving for its own sake, the way humans seem programmed to seek not just comfort but challenge, not just survival but significance, and this will to power manifests everywhere in human society, from the child insisting on doing something difficult rather than accepting help, to the athlete training past exhaustion, to the scientist pursuing an obscure research question that may never have practical application. Yet we have so thoroughly normalized this striving impulse that we rarely pause to examine whether it truly serves our well-being or whether we have simply accepted it as an immutable feature of human nature without question. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the übermensch represents one of philosophy's most misunderstood and deliberately provocative ideas, describing an idealized human being who transcends conventional morality and societal limitations through sheer force of will and self-creation. Imagine a person who rejects the comfortable certainties that bind ordinary people to religious doctrine, social convention, and herd morality, instead creating their own values and meaning through an intensely personal struggle against both external resistance and internal weakness. This figure embodies what Nietzsche called will to power, a fundamental drive not merely to dominate others, but to continually overcome oneself, to grow stronger through confronting challenges and adversities that would break weaker spirits. The psychological mechanism underlying this concept stems from Nietzsche's observation that human beings are fundamentally unequal in their capacities for creation, courage, and self-transformation, and that society's emphasis on universal equality and shared moral systems actually prevents the most exceptional individuals from achieving their fullest potential. Rather than accepting predetermined roles and inherited value systems, the Übermensch actively constructs meaning through artistic creation, philosophical thought, or any pursuit that demands absolute authenticity and personal responsibility. The concept persists in contemporary culture despite its troubling history of appropriation and misinterpretation, perhaps because it addresses a deep human yearning to transcend ordinariness and to believe that individual will and vision can genuinely reshape reality itself. We see echoes of the Übermensch ideal in our celebration of visionary entrepreneurs, revolutionary artists, and charismatic leaders who seem to operate by their own rules, even as we've largely forgotten that Nietzsche explicitly warned against using this concept to justify domination or violence against others. The irony is that by the time we recognize someone as truly exceptional, they have already become a symbol appropriated by collective consciousness, absorbed into the very herd morality the original Übermensch was meant to transcend. This paradox suggests that the Übermensch may ultimately be less a destination we can reach than a direction we travel toward, a perpetual striving that loses its essence the moment it achieves recognition or settles into ideology. In this light, perhaps Nietzsche's greatest contribution was not describing what the Übermensch is, but rather challenging us to question what we have accepted as normal, inevitable, and worthy of our allegiance. Imagine standing at a crossroads in your life, confronted with a single question that Friedrich Nietzsche posed to shake the very foundations of human existence. Would you be willing to live your exact life again, in every detail, infinitely many times, forever repeating the same moments, the same choices, the same suffering and joy, cycling through eternity without end or variation? This is the concept of eternal return, a philosophical thought experiment that forces us to examine not just how we live, but whether we could genuinely affirm our lives as worth living if they were destined to repeat infinitely. The mechanism behind this theory operates on a profound psychological level, challenging the human tendency to defer meaning and happiness to some imagined future state, to some distant accomplishment or transformed circumstance that will finally make our lives feel significant and complete. When confronted with the eternal return thought experiment, most people immediately recoil, recognizing instinctively that they would not want to repeat their lives as they currently exist, which reveals the uncomfortable truth that we are often living inauthentically, pursuing goals and values that were never truly our own, or enduring suffering that we have unconsciously accepted as inevitable rather than actively choosing. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what we might call existential avoidance, a fundamental human pattern where we convince ourselves that our current circumstances are temporary, that real life will begin once we achieve the next milestone, once we have more money, more status, the right relationship, or better health, perpetually living as though we are in a waiting room rather than actually inhabiting our existence. Nietzsche proposed eternal return not as a literal cosmological claim about the nature of time and the universe, but rather as a practical test of life affirmation, a diagnostic tool that reveals whether we have been living courageously according to our own values, or whether we have been sleepwalking through existence in compliance with inherited beliefs and external expectations that drain authentic meaning from our days. Despite the logical simplicity of this framework, humanity continues to defer, to postpone, to treat the present moment as mere scaffolding for some future construction that we believe will finally be worth celebrating. and we have normalized this temporal displacement so thoroughly that most people barely notice they are doing it, moving through decades of their finite existence in a state of perpetual incompleteness, always becoming but never simply being. Always preparing for the actual life that we imagine must be waiting for us somewhere beyond the horizon of our current circumstances. Imagine a society where those with power and strength openly celebrate their dominance, where the wealthy flaunt their superiority without apology, and where the strong explicitly declare themselves morally superior to the weak. This was, according to the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the natural state of human moral systems before a curious psychological inversion took place throughout history. Nietzsche proposed that morality itself emerged not from universal truths, but from two entirely different sources rooted in power dynamics and resentment. The master morality, he argued, was created by the strong and powerful who naturally valued what benefited them: strength, beauty, nobility, pride, and the freedom to pursue their desires without restraint. For these individuals, good meant powerful, excellent, and life-affirming, while bad simply meant weak, common, and inferior. This was an honest morality born from abundance and creative force. However, Nietzsche observed that the weak and enslaved populations could never compete with their masters through strength alone, so they developed an entirely different moral system as a psychological survival mechanism. They inverted the master's values entirely, declaring that weakness was actually virtue, that suffering was noble, that humility was righteous, and that the meek would inherit the earth. Slave morality transformed their powerlessness into a moral advantage by redefining their condition as spiritually superior. The mechanism behind this psychological inversion is remarkably cunning. When you cannot defeat your oppressor physically, you defeat them morally by declaring their values corrupt and your suffering redemptive. This allowed the enslaved to maintain dignity and psychological coherence in their subordination. What makes this theory peculiarly haunting is Nietzsche's claim that slave morality has become so deeply embedded in modern civilization, particularly through Christianity and democratic ideologies, that we no longer recognize it as a reaction to powerlessness. We have normalized the celebration of suffering, the condemnation of strength, and the elevation of compassion and equality as ultimate goods, all while forgetting these values originated as weapons of the weak against the strong. We continue to perpetuate this inverted morality even when we ourselves possess power, even when we are no longer slaves, suggesting that the psychological patterns embedded in our moral frameworks persist long after their original purpose has vanished. Imagine standing in a room looking at a simple wooden chair and consider what you are actually perceiving when you examine it. You see a particular shade of brown, you feel the texture of the wood grain beneath your fingertips, you hear the subtle creaking sound when you shift your weight upon it, you smell the faint scent of old timber, and you sense its solid form occupying space in the room. The bundle theory proposes something genuinely unsettling about this seemingly straightforward experience. There is no actual chair existing as a unified object beneath all these properties. What you call a chair is merely a collection of bundled sensations and properties held together by habit and linguistic convenience, with no deeper substance or essence that binds them into a singular thing. This philosophical framework emerged primarily through the work of David Hume, who argued that when we introspect and examine our experience carefully, we never encounter objects themselves, only the fleeting impressions and sensations they produce. The psychological mechanism underlying our resistance to this idea involves our overwhelming cognitive bias toward unity and permanence. Our brains evolved to organize sensory information into coherent wholes because this survival strategy worked exceptionally well in ancestral environments. Seeing a tiger as a unified predator rather than a collection of separate sensations meant the difference between becoming prey and remaining alive. Over developmental time, this neurological bundling became so automatic and seamless that we experience objects as fundamentally unified entities rather than as provisional collections of properties. The bundle theory persists despite its logical counterintuitiveness because it challenges something so deeply embedded in our perceptual and conceptual architecture that questioning it feels almost absurd in everyday life. Yet contemporary physics and neuroscience have lent the theory unexpected credibility, as quantum mechanics reveals that subatomic particles themselves lack definite properties until observation occurs, and neuroscience demonstrates that our sense of coherent objects emerges from active neural construction rather than passive reception. We have normalized treating bundles of properties as if they were singular substances, because this convention enables us to communicate and function within shared reality. Yet the bundle theory whispers that this convenience might be closer to the actual truth than our intuitions suggest. When you disassemble a chair entirely, removing legs, seat, and back, the bundled properties scatter, yet nothing essential has been lost, only the particular arrangement that made the collection functionally recognizable as chair. Imagine sitting alone in your room, reflecting on who you are, and suddenly becoming aware that the very sense of self doing the reflecting might be nothing more than an illusion constructed moment by moment. This is the starting point of the no-self doctrine, a concept that emerges most prominently in Buddhist philosophy, but also finds unexpected resonance in modern neuroscience and psychology. When you examine your own consciousness carefully, attempting to locate some essential, unchanging core of identity that persists through time, you begin to notice something rather unsettling. There is no unified entity present, only a constantly shifting stream of sensations, thoughts, emotions, and perceptions that we have learned to bundle together and call a self. The doctrine suggests that what we call the self is actually an aggregation of 5 skandhas, or bundles of experience: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, none of which contains any permanent essence that could be called you, and each of which is constantly changing and interdependent on the others. When you look inward seeking this self, much like trying to find the exact center of an onion by peeling back its layers, you only find more layers, never arriving at any substantial core. The psychological mechanism underlying why this doctrine emerged and persists involves how our brains naturally construct a narrative identity as an adaptive survival mechanism. Our brains cannot process the sheer complexity of reality as a fragmented, discontinuous stream of experiences without losing functional coherence. So evolution has shaped us to create a persistent illusion of selfhood that allows us to plan, remember, and navigate our social world effectively. We experience this illusion so seamlessly and constantly that we never question its fundamental validity, and we perpetually reinforce it through language itself, which is structured around the assumption of an unchanging subject performing actions and having experiences. Despite mounting evidence from neuroscience suggesting that consciousness is actually distributed, embodied, and constructed through multiple simultaneous processes rather than unified in some executive center, we continue to operate and feel as though we are singular, coherent beings, and this persistent normalization of the self-illusion seems almost necessary for psychological functioning and social interaction in the world as we have constructed it. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your mind, your memories, and your sense of self have been completely transferred into the body of someone else, while that person's consciousness now inhabits your body. The prince who grew up in a palace, educated in philosophy and the arts, accustomed to luxury and command, suddenly finds himself in the worn body of a humble cobbler, while the cobbler's mind now occupies the royal form. According to the philosophical framework established by John Locke in the 17th century, the prince would still be the prince, and the cobbler would still be the cobbler, not because of their bodies, but because consciousness and memory follow the person, not the flesh. The prince would still possess all his recollections of his royal upbringing, his education, his experiences of privilege, and his understanding of his own identity, even though he now finds himself in a body accustomed to standing at a workbench, hammering leather and shaping souls. Meanwhile, the cobbler, despite now possessing the prince's body with all its strength and health, would retain memories of a simple life of labor and modest means. This thought experiment challenges our intuitive sense that a person is defined by their physical form, their social status, or their material circumstances. Yet throughout human history, we have organized societies, legal systems, and hierarchies based almost entirely on bodies and social positions rather than on consciousness and continuity of memory. We treat princes as inherently superior and cobblers as inherently inferior, assigning them different rights, different privileges, and different values, even though consciousness is indivisible and the mind knows no class distinction. The mechanism underlying this contradiction is our reliance on external markers to determine identity and worth, a system so deeply embedded in social structures that we rarely question whether these markers actually correspond to anything meaningful about the person underneath. We see the purple robes and the crown and assume superiority, or we see the leather apron and assume limitation, despite the possibility that consciousness itself remains entirely untouched by such superficial designations. This paradox persists because societies require visible ordering systems, and our brains are wired to trust what we can perceive, even when logic suggests we should prioritize the invisible substance of consciousness and experience. Imagine a magnificent wooden ship that has sailed the seas for centuries, carrying heroes and treasures across vast oceans, its hull weathered by salt and storm. Over the years, as planks of wood rot and splinter from exposure to the elements, the ship's builders replace them one by one with new timber, maintaining the vessel's seaworthiness and ensuring it can continue its voyages for generations to come. A plank here, a beam there, until eventually, after sufficient time has passed, not a single piece of the original ship remains. Every component has been swapped out for fresh wood, yet the ship still sails under the same name, carries the same history, and maintains the same form and function as it always has. Now consider this puzzling question that troubled the ancient philosopher Theseus himself. If every part of the ship has been replaced, is it still truly the same ship? The mechanism behind this paradox operates on our fundamental assumption that identity depends on material composition, yet we simultaneously believe that identity persists through change, creating an irreconcilable tension in our understanding of what makes something itself. When we observe the ship throughout its reconstruction, we track its continuity through space and time, we maintain an unbroken narrative of its existence, and we recognize its form and function as constant. Yet the moment we acknowledge that 0% of its original matter remains, our intuitions splinter into competing theories about what identity actually means. What makes this paradox endure so powerfully in human thought is that we encounter this same puzzle everywhere in our lives without recognizing it. Your body completely replaces its cells over 7 years, yet you believe yourself to be the same person. Civilizations maintain their identity through cultural transmission, while their populations entirely turn over. Institutions persist across centuries, despite having no original members or buildings remaining. We have simply normalized this contradiction by refusing to interrogate it deeply, accepting that things can be completely different in composition, yet somehow remain fundamentally themselves, and we organize entire legal and social systems around this comfortable fiction, never quite admitting that the boundary between the original ship and a completely reconstructed one might be entirely arbitrary, a matter of perspective rather than metaphysical fact. Yet perhaps this is not a flaw in our thinking but a feature. Identity may be less about material substance and ever-present atoms, and more about the narrative we weave, the continuity we perceive, and the purposes we collectively agree to honor, making the Ship of Theseus not a paradox to solve, but a mirror reflecting how we construct meaning itself. Imagine standing before a pile of sand on a beach, watching as someone removes one grain at a time, and consider the philosophical puzzle that emerges from this seemingly simple act. The Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, presents us with a logical problem that has troubled philosophers for over 2,000 years, originating in ancient Greece and continuing to perplex modern thinkers who attempt to define the boundaries of vague concepts. The paradox operates through a deceptively straightforward chain of reasoning that appears logically sound at every step, yet somehow arrives at a conclusion that contradicts our intuitive understanding of the world. When we begin with a clear heap of sand, perhaps containing 1,000,000 grains, we can universally agree that this is indeed a heap, and if we remove a single grain, we would insist that what remains is still a heap, because one grain cannot constitute the difference between a heap and a non-heap. Following this logic through countless iterations, removing one grain at a time, and maintaining that each successive removal does not transform a heap into a non-heap, we eventually find ourselves claiming that a single grain of sand is somehow a heap, which strikes our common sense as absurd and obviously false. The mechanism that sustains this paradox lies in the fuzzy nature of language and the vagueness inherent in our concepts of ordinary objects and properties. The term heap has no precise boundary. There is no magical number where we can definitively say that at 999 grains we have a heap, but at 998 grains we do not, and our minds resist drawing such arbitrary lines because we recognize their fundamental groundlessness. We accept the principle of tolerance, the notion that small differences cannot matter in categorical distinctions, because this principle feels intuitively true, and because our cognitive systems naturally group similar things together rather than creating sharp divisions. Yet this same principle, when applied repeatedly in a chain of reasoning, leads us inexorably toward conclusions that our intuitions vehemently reject. The persistence of the Sorites paradox, despite our intellectual understanding of its logical structure, reveals something profound about how humans navigate a world of imprecise categories using precise language, and how we have learned to live comfortably with inherent contradictions embedded in the very foundations of our conceptual frameworks. Imagine you encounter a person who makes a single statement. This sentence is false. You pause, trying to evaluate whether what they've said is true or false, and immediately you find yourself trapped in an infinite loop of logical contradiction that refuses to resolve. If the statement is true, then it must be false because that is what it claims. But if it is false, then the statement itself becomes true because it accurately describes its own falsity. You cannot assign it a truth value without immediately invalidating that very assignment, creating a self-referential trap that has confounded logicians, philosophers, and mathematicians for over 2,000 years, dating back to the ancient Greeks and their explorations of paradox. This is the liar's paradox, perhaps the most elegant and devastating demonstration of how language can fold back upon itself and create logical impossibilities through the sheer mechanism of self-reference. The paradox reveals something profound about the nature of truth, language, and the systems we use to describe reality, because it shows that our normal logical frameworks, the ones that seem so reliable and universal, contain hidden vulnerabilities when they encounter statements that refer to themselves. In classical logic, every meaningful statement should be either true or false, but the liar's paradox exists in a kind of twilight zone where neither option remains stable or consistent. Philosophers and logicians have proposed countless solutions, from simply excluding self-referential statements as meaningless, to developing entirely new logical systems that allow for degrees of truth rather than binary true or false values, to arguing that the statement contains a hidden context that disambiguates its meaning. Yet despite all these intellectual efforts to contain and resolve the paradox, it persists as a fundamental challenge to our assumptions about language and logic, suggesting that perhaps our entire framework for understanding truth may have limitations we have not yet fully grasped or acknowledged. And perhaps that is precisely the point. The liar's paradox may not be a flaw to be corrected, but rather a mirror held up to the boundaries of rational thought itself, revealing that some truths about language and logic may exist beyond the reach of the very systems we use to describe them. When we encounter the liar's paradox, we are not merely solving a logical puzzle. We are confronting the possibility that language itself may be fundamentally incomplete, that there exist certain truths about our own systems of meaning-making that cannot be fully articulated from within those systems, much like a map that cannot contain itself without infinite recursion. In 1931, a mathematician named Kurt Gödel published two theorems that fundamentally shattered the mathematical world's confidence in its own foundations, proving that within any consistent system of formal logic, there will always exist true statements that cannot be proven from within that system itself, meaning that no matter how carefully you construct the rules and axioms that govern mathematics, you will inevitably reach statements that are undeniably true yet impossible to verify using only the tools available within your own logical framework. The implications are staggering when you consider that mathematics has been humanity's most reliable language for describing objective truth, the one discipline where certainty seems absolute and provable, and yet Gödel demonstrated that even in this crystalline realm of pure logic, there exist permanent gaps between what is true and what can be proven true. The mechanism underlying this strange phenomenon operates through self-reference and the creation of statements that essentially say things about their own provability within a system, much like a sentence that claims, "This statement cannot be proven in this system," which creates a logical paradox that forces the system into a corner where it must either accept incompleteness or admit that it contains contradictions. What makes this so philosophically disorienting is that we have built our entire scientific understanding on the assumption that sufficiently rigorous logical systems can capture complete truth, that with enough axioms and careful reasoning, we could eventually describe everything about reality with mathematical precision. Yet Gödel proved this beautiful vision is fundamentally impossible. That any system powerful enough to describe even basic arithmetic will necessarily contain propositions that are true but unprovable within its own structure. We have normalized this incompleteness by compartmentalizing it, by treating Gödel's theorems as profound mathematical results, while continuing to operate as though our physical theories and logical frameworks can approach completeness given enough time and effort, accepting without deep consideration that there will always be mysteries, always be truths that lie just beyond the reach of our most powerful tools, and this strange acceptance reflects a kind of cognitive resignation. A quiet acknowledgement that our quest for total understanding will never truly finish, that some doors will remain closed not because we lack intelligence or effort, but because the very structure of logic itself forbids us from opening them. Yet perhaps this incompleteness is not a flaw but a feature, a necessary condition for systems to remain consistent, for truth to exceed our grasp, and for discovery itself to remain eternally possible. Imagine a librarian tasked with creating two master catalogs for a vast library, one containing the titles of all books that reference themselves within their own pages, and another containing the titles of all books that do not reference themselves. A seemingly straightforward organizational task that should present no philosophical difficulties whatsoever. Yet when the librarian completes this second catalog and then faces the inevitable question of whether this master catalog itself belongs in its own pages, a peculiar logical trap emerges that has haunted mathematics and philosophy for over a century. If the catalog does contain itself, then by its own definition it should not, because it only lists books that do not reference themselves, yet if it does not contain itself, then by that same definition it must, creating an infinite loop of contradiction that cannot be resolved through any conventional logical framework. This is the essence of Russell's paradox, discovered by the British philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell in 1901, a puzzle that emerged while he was examining the foundations of set theory, that supposedly ironclad mathematical system upon which all of modern mathematics was believed to rest. The paradox operates on the fundamental principle that sets can be defined by their membership criteria, and we can create sets of almost anything we desire, yet some sets contain themselves as members while others do not, a distinction that seems perfectly sensible until you attempt to categorize the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our natural tendency to assume that language and logic systems are internally consistent and complete, that any well-formed question should have a definite answer, and that we can always classify things into neat categories without encountering paradoxes or contradictions along the way. Russell's discovery fundamentally shattered the confidence of mathematicians who believed set theory provided a secure foundation for all mathematical knowledge, forcing the entire discipline to confront the possibility that even the most basic logical systems might harbor hidden contradictions at their core. Imagine standing in a vast cosmic cathedral where everything moves, everything changes, everything is in constant flux, yet at the very center of this grand machinery exists something that does not move at all, something that causes all motion without experiencing motion itself. And this is the profound paradox at the heart of Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, a being or force so perfect and complete that it requires no change, no movement, no alteration whatsoever. And yet its very existence sets the entire universe into perpetual motion like an object of desire that draws all things toward it without ever reaching back. The mechanism works like this. Imagine a magnet that does not push or pull through physical force, but instead attracts everything by the sheer perfection of its being, by being the object of all desire and contemplation, and thus all things move toward it, orbit around it, and strive to become like it. And in this way, the unmoved mover causes all motion not through action, but through being the ultimate object of all aspiration and love. The thing that everything else in the universe contemplates and desires and moves toward without the mover itself, ever having to lift a finger or change in any way whatsoever. We have normalized this concept so deeply that we do not even recognize how strange it is, how it persists in our physics and philosophy and spirituality, despite the apparent logical contradiction that something unchanging can cause change. And yet this idea appears again and again across human thought, in religious conceptions of God as eternal and unchanging, in the laws of physics that seem to operate from principles that never alter themselves, in the notion that consciousness itself might be a fundamental constant from which all experience flows without the consciousness itself requiring change or motion. And perhaps this is why the concept endures. It offers a way to think about causation that doesn't require infinite regression, a solution to the problem of how anything can ever truly begin, and it whispers to us that somewhere beneath all the noise and motion and desperate striving, there might be something still and perfect that we are all, unknowingly, moving toward. And in our own lives, we glimpse this dynamic whenever we find ourselves irresistibly drawn toward an ideal, a vision of who we might become, a work of art that seems to pull us into its orbit, a person whose mere presence inspires us to move and change, and we realize that the greatest forces shaping our existence may not be the ones that push us violently forward, but rather the ones we choose to move toward, the silent gravitational centers of meaning around which our becoming revolves. Imagine you are walking across a heath on a cloudy afternoon, and your foot strikes something hard half buried in the grass. You pick it up and discover an intricately crafted pocket watch, its face gleaming despite centuries of weathering, its internal mechanisms so perfectly calibrated that each gear meshes with its neighbors in flawless synchronization. You would immediately conclude that this watch was not the product of chance or natural erosion, but rather the deliberate creation of a skilled craftsman who understood the principles of mechanics and designed each component with purposeful intention. This moment of discovery becomes the foundation for one of philosophy's most enduring arguments, first articulated by William Paley in 1802, and yet the logic underlying it reaches back much further into human reasoning and continues to shape how we understand design, purpose, and creation in the world around us. The watchmaker argument proceeds from this simple observation. Just as the watch's complexity and functionality immediately suggest the existence of an intelligent designer who crafted it with specific goals in mind, the natural world displays an even greater complexity and sophistication than any human artifact. The eye with its lens and retina, the heart with its chambers and valves, the genome with its billions of information-carrying sequences all demonstrate an organization and purposefulness so profound that they too must be products of intentional design rather than random processes. The psychological mechanism at work here taps into a fundamental human cognitive tendency to recognize patterns and attribute purpose to them, a tendency that evolved because it often served us well in identifying both threats and opportunities in our environment. When we encounter something beautifully organized or functionally sophisticated, our minds instinctively search for an intentional creator because in our ancestral past, objects and systems that worked well usually had been made by someone with knowledge and skill. This intuition feels immediately compelling, almost self-evident, which is precisely why the argument has persisted for centuries despite the emergence of modern evolutionary biology and our deepened understanding of how natural selection can produce extraordinary complexity without any conscious designer whatsoever. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection fundamentally undermined the watchmaker argument by demonstrating that complexity can arise through countless generations of differential reproduction and environmental pressure. Yet the argument maintains its rhetorical power because it still captures something psychologically true about how our minds assess causation and intentionality. Imagine standing in a library where a medieval monk sits at a wooden desk, quill in hand, attempting to prove the existence of God through pure thought alone, without looking to nature, scripture, or experience, but rather by examining what the very concept of perfection demands to be true. This is the ontological argument in its most essential form, a philosophical maneuver so audacious and peculiar that it has captivated and frustrated thinkers for nearly 1,000 years, beginning with Saint Anselm in the 11th century and continuing through Descartes, Leibniz, and into contemporary philosophy, where it remains both celebrated and debunked with remarkable regularity. The mechanism at work here involves a peculiar leap from the realm of thought into the realm of being, where Anselm reasons that God, by definition, is that which nothing greater can be conceived, and since existence in reality is greater than existence merely in the mind, God must necessarily exist in reality or else the definition would be contradictory and incomplete. This argument accomplishes something extraordinary. It attempts to derive the existence of something from the internal logical structure of its own definition, treating being itself as a predicate that must attach to the concept of supreme perfection, much as we might say that a triangle must have three sides, not because we observe triangles having three sides, but because the very meaning of triangle demands this property. What makes the ontological argument persist in philosophical discourse, despite centuries of sophisticated objections, is perhaps our deep intuition that the nature of concepts and reality must somehow align, that definitions carry weight beyond mere words, and that certain ideas possess a kind of necessity that transcends mere imagination. We continue to find something compelling about the notion that perfection cannot logically lack the property of existence, even as we simultaneously recognize the profound conceptual problems with treating existence as a property at all, with critics from Kant onward arguing that existence is not a predicate but a presupposition, and that we cannot magically conjure real things into being through sufficiently clever reasoning about their supposed nature. Yet perhaps the argument's real power lies not in its logical validity, but in what it reveals about the structure of human thought itself, that we cannot help but imagine perfection as a coherent totality, and that the very act of conceiving of God as supremely perfect inevitably produces a kind of conceptual vertigo, a dizzying sense that thought and reality have touched at some fundamental point, even if we cannot quite articulate how or why such contact should occur. Imagine standing before a hospital ward filled with children suffering from terminal illnesses, their small bodies weakened by conditions they did nothing to deserve, their parents devastated by a suffering that seems entirely arbitrary and without purpose, and you begin to confront one of philosophy's most ancient and troubling questions. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God exists, why does evil persist in the world at all? This is the problem of evil, and it strikes at the very heart of theodicy, the attempt to reconcile the existence of suffering with the existence of a benevolent divine being. The logical mechanism underlying this philosophical puzzle is deceptively simple yet profoundly difficult to resolve, for it presents us with what appears to be an irreconcilable contradiction between three propositions that most people intuitively accept: that God is omnipotent and therefore capable of preventing all suffering, that God is omniscient and therefore aware of all suffering that occurs or will occur, and that God is perfectly good and therefore would want to prevent suffering if possible. Yet suffering clearly exists in abundance, from natural disasters that kill thousands indiscriminately to diseases that torture both the innocent and the guilty with equal cruelty, suggesting that at least one of these three premises must be false. Philosophers and theologians have wrestled with this problem for millennia, proposing countless responses including the free will defense, which argues that God permits evil because genuine human freedom requires the possibility of choosing wrongly, or the soul-making theodicy, which contends that spiritual growth and moral development require adversity and suffering. Others have suggested that God is not actually omnipotent or omniscient in the way we imagine, or that God is entirely separate from the natural world and does not intervene in it, or even that evil is necessary as a counterpoint to good, an absence rather than a presence. What remains remarkable is how this problem continues to persist as a serious philosophical concern despite centuries of attempted solutions, for no response has achieved universal acceptance or fully satisfied the emotional and intellectual objections that arise when confronting genuine suffering in the world. Perhaps this persistent difficulty reveals something important, that the problem of evil may not be fundamentally a logical puzzle to be solved through argument, but rather an existential challenge that each person must confront anew when facing their own or another's undeserved suffering, where abstract philosophical responses often ring hollow against the raw reality of pain. Imagine standing in the aftermath of profound suffering. A child lies in a hospital bed, a natural disaster has leveled a community, or disease has claimed someone you loved, and in that moment of anguish, you find yourself wrestling with a question that has haunted human consciousness for millennia. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why does evil exist in the world? This is the fundamental problem that theodicy attempts to solve, and it represents one of the most psychologically demanding philosophical endeavors humanity has undertaken, because it forces us to reconcile our deepest beliefs about the nature of divinity with the observable reality of senseless pain and undeserved misery. The logical mechanism at work here is deceptively simple yet infinitely complex. Theodicy emerges from the collision between three seemingly incompatible attributes that most religious traditions assign to God: omnipotence, omniscience, and benevolence. If God knows all suffering that will occur, possesses the power to prevent it, and genuinely loves creation, then logically he should eliminate evil entirely, and yet evil persists across every corner of human experience with relentless inevitability. Religious philosophers and theologians have constructed elaborate frameworks to resolve this tension, proposing that free will requires the possibility of evil, that suffering serves spiritual purposes through growth and redemption, that evil represents the necessary absence of good rather than a positive force, or that divine purposes operate on timescales and according to logics entirely beyond human comprehension. Yet despite centuries of sophisticated argumentation, theodicy remains fundamentally unresolved because it demands that we either limit God's power, deny his knowledge, question his goodness, or accept that our minds cannot grasp his plan, each option representing a painful compromise with our intuitions about divinity. What allows theodicy to persist as a philosophical project rather than collapsing into despair is the human capacity for faith that transcends logic, the psychological necessity of meaning-making in the face of chaos, and our deep-rooted tendency to construct narratives that preserve our most cherished worldviews even when empirical reality seems to argue against them, creating a peculiar intellectual space where reason and belief dance around each other without ever achieving final reconciliation. Imagine standing before a sacred authority figure, perhaps a priest or a deeply revered moral teacher, and asking them a deceptively simple question. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? This is the essence of the Euthyphro dilemma, a question posed by Socrates to a young man named Euthyphro in Plato's ancient dialogue, and it remains one of philosophy's most elegant logical traps that has trapped thinking minds for over 2,000 years. The situation itself involves a confrontation with the very foundations of how we justify our moral beliefs and our adherence to authority, creating a fork in the road where every path leads to philosophical difficulty. We find ourselves in a position where we must choose between two seemingly reasonable but deeply problematic options, and this choice haunts our moral reasoning, whether we acknowledge it consciously or not. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about circular reasoning and the nature of moral justification itself. For if something is good merely because an authority commands it, then goodness becomes arbitrary and dependent on power rather than principle, which seems intuitively wrong to most people. Conversely, if God or authority commands something because it is independently good, then goodness exists prior to and independent of that authority, suggesting that morality operates on its own logical plane, and the authority is merely recognizing what is already true rather than creating it. This dilemma persists in our modern world with surprising resilience, because we have never truly resolved the underlying tension between respecting legitimate authority and maintaining principled moral reasoning. And we navigate this space by largely avoiding the question altogether, defaulting to cultural norms and inherited traditions without examining whether we believe them to be intrinsically good or merely conventionally established. We accept moral teachings because they come from sources we trust, yet we simultaneously maintain the intuition that these teachings must be grounded in something deeper than mere command, and this contradiction remains unexamined in the background of how we actually live and make decisions about right and wrong. When we praise a parent for teaching us kindness, we implicitly assume kindness itself is worthy of praise, not merely because the parent commanded it, but because we recognize its inherent value. Yet we rarely pause to ask whether that recognition comes from reason, emotion, culture, or some mysterious combination that we have simply accepted without scrutiny. Imagine standing at a crossroads in the 17th century, a time when the Catholic Church wielded immense spiritual and temporal power, yet the scientific revolution was beginning to cast doubt upon traditional religious certainties, and you find yourself genuinely uncertain about whether God exists or not, unable to resolve this question through reason alone, unable to arrive at absolute proof either way. And you must still make a choice about how to live your life and what to believe with the limited information available to you. This is the predicament that the French philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal found himself contemplating, and from this deeply human situation of radical uncertainty, he constructed an argument that has fascinated and troubled philosophers for centuries, an argument that attempts to solve the problem of religious belief not through appeals to faith or empirical evidence, but through the mathematics of probability and the logic of gain and loss. Pascal reasoned that when faced with the question of God's existence, you essentially stand before a wager with four possible outcomes, and if God exists and you believe, you gain infinite reward in the form of eternal salvation, but if God exists and you do not believe, you suffer infinite punishment and eternal damnation, whereas if God does not exist and you believe, you lose relatively little in this finite life through the constraints of religious practice. And if God does not exist and you do not believe, you gain the freedom of this life but lose nothing infinite. From a purely rational calculation perspective, Pascal argued, the mathematics becomes overwhelmingly clear because any finite loss or gain is negligible when weighed against the possibility of infinite reward or punishment, which means that even if you assign only a small probability to God's existence, the expected value of belief still outweighs disbelief infinitely, making belief the rationally superior wager regardless of your actual conviction. The psychological mechanism underlying this argument is remarkably powerful because it transforms a question of faith into a question of self-interest, reframing religious belief as a prudent investment rather than a matter of the heart or spirit, and it appeals to something deeply human in us. The desire to hedge our bets, to protect ourselves against catastrophic loss, to make decisions based on risk assessment rather than conviction. Imagine yourself standing beside a railway track, watching a runaway trolley barreling down the line at tremendous speed toward 5 workers who stand helplessly in its path, unaware of the danger approaching them. You notice a lever within your reach that could divert the trolley onto a side track, but there is a single person working alone on that alternate route, someone who would certainly be killed if you pull the lever and redirect the trolley toward them. The choice before you is starkly binary: do nothing and allow 5 people to die, or actively intervene and cause the death of one innocent person through your own deliberate action. This is the trolley problem, one of philosophy's most enduring thought experiments, first formulated by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later expanded by Judith Thomson. The scenario forces us to confront a fundamental tension in human moral reasoning that has puzzled ethicists, psychologists, and ordinary people for decades. The mechanism underlying this dilemma operates on the distinction between omission and commission, between passive allowance of harm and active participation in causing harm. When presented with this scenario, most people report that they would pull the lever, accepting that killing one person is morally preferable to allowing 5 to die, a utilitarian calculation that maximizes overall survival. However, when the scenario is modified so that instead of pulling a lever, you must physically push a large person off a bridge to stop the trolley, thereby using their body as a brake to save the 5 others, most people report that they cannot bring themselves to do this, despite the mathematical outcome being identical. The same 5 people are saved and the same 1 person dies, yet the addition of direct physical contact and the sense of using someone's body as a mere instrument triggers profound moral resistance. This inconsistency persists despite having no logical justification when examined through purely rational frameworks, revealing that our moral intuitions operate on multiple systems simultaneously rather than following a single coherent principle, and we continue to navigate this paradox without ever fully resolving whether our hesitation represents genuine moral wisdom or merely an evolutionary artifact left over from our distant past. Imagine a person lying motionless on a crowded city street while dozens of pedestrians walk past without stopping, without calling for help, without even pausing to check if the stranger is alive or dead. This scene has played out countless times throughout modern history, most famously in the case of Kitty Genovese in 1964, where it was reported that 38 witnesses saw or heard her being attacked, yet none intervened or contacted police until it was far too late. The bystander effect, also called the diffusion of responsibility, describes a deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon where the presence of other people actually reduces the likelihood that any single individual will help someone in distress. When you are alone and witness an emergency, you feel the full weight of moral responsibility pressing down upon you, and your brain recognizes that you are the only possible help available. But when you are surrounded by others, something strange happens in your mind and in the minds of everyone around you. Each person begins to assume that someone else will take action, that perhaps the situation is not as serious as it appears, that intervention is not their responsibility, but rather belongs to someone more qualified or better positioned to help. The mechanism operates through a kind of diffused accountability where moral weight gets distributed across the group like water spreading across a surface, becoming thinner and thinner until it seems to vanish entirely. This phenomenon persists stubbornly in our modern world despite decades of psychological research documenting its existence and despite our intellectual understanding of its mechanisms. We know that we are susceptible to this cognitive bias, yet knowing does not protect us from falling into it. The strange paradox is that even when we are aware of the bystander effect, even when we have read about it and considered how it might apply to us, we still find ourselves frozen in crowds, still assuming that someone else will help, still rationalizing our inaction through the comforting fiction that intervention is not our responsibility. We have normalized a kind of moral abdication that contradicts our deepest ethical principles about the sanctity of human life and our obligations to one another. Yet the bystander effect need not be inevitable. Studies have shown that when individuals are explicitly trained to recognize emergencies and feel personally accountable, when someone makes direct eye contact and says, "You call for help," the paralysis breaks and action follows. We possess the capacity to overcome this cognitive trap, not through willpower alone, but through intentional restructuring of how we perceive our role in moments of crisis. Consider two drivers who both decide to text while driving, both equally distracted and both equally reckless in their decision-making, yet one arrives home safely while the other strikes a pedestrian and causes severe injury or death. From the perspective of pure moral philosophy, both drivers made identical moral choices with identical intentions and identical negligence, and yet one will face criminal charges, social condemnation, and the weight of knowing they've destroyed a life, while the other goes home without incident and without consequence. This is moral luck, and it reveals a profound inconsistency in how we assign moral responsibility and blame. The concept suggests that the moral status of our actions depends partly on factors entirely outside our control, factors that have nothing to do with our character, our intentions, or the deliberateness of our choices. The driver who hit the pedestrian did nothing morally worse than the driver who didn't, and yet we judge them entirely differently. This happens because we collapse together two distinct elements, what philosophers call the agent's subjective culpability, which is about what they knew and intended, and the objective consequences of their actions, which may be determined entirely by chance. Our moral intuitions have evolved to care deeply about consequences because in practical terms, consequences matter enormously. A reckless driver who injures someone has caused real harm in the world, and our sense of justice demands proportional response. But this creates a logical problem because we're essentially punishing people for bad luck, for the accidents of circumstance that fell outside the scope of their control. The persistence of moral luck in our everyday judgments reveals that we haven't truly internalized the philosophical principle that people should only be held responsible for what lies within their power. We say that intentions matter, that only the agent's choices should determine their moral culpability, and yet in practice, we constantly hold people accountable for consequences they couldn't have predicted or prevented, as though they should have possessed perfect foresight or magical control over the world around them. This becomes even more strange when we examine it in contexts like prenatal circumstances, where we acknowledge that being born into poverty versus wealth affects moral development, or in historical luck, where being born in a society that permits slavery affects what moral norms you'll be taught. We recognize these as unfair, as examples of people being judged by standards that presume control they never possessed, and yet we continue applying similar logic in countless scenarios throughout our moral and legal systems, operating as though the universe cares about equity in a way it clearly does not. Imagine a couple deciding whether to have a child now or wait a few years until they are more financially stable, and imagine further that the timing of conception will determine which specific child is born, since even a difference of weeks or months in conception will result in a completely different person entering the world due to the combination of genetic factors involved. Now suppose the couple decides to wait, and they have a child several years later who lives a perfectly good life, happy and fulfilled. The non-identity problem asks us a troubling question. Did the couple do anything wrong by waiting, given that their decision resulted in the existence of a person whose life is genuinely worth living? The logical puzzle emerges because we struggle to identify who exactly was harmed by their choice. If they had conceived earlier, a different person would have existed instead, one we cannot identify or reference, and that earlier conceived person never actually came into existence to suffer any harm. The person who actually exists now cannot claim to have been wronged because their existence depends entirely on the decision to wait, and without that decision, they would never have been born at all. This creates a conceptual trap in our moral reasoning where it seems impossible to say the couple acted immorally even in cases where their behavior was clearly reckless or negligent, such as if they had exposed themselves to environmental toxins or engaged in substance abuse during the waiting period, thereby ensuring their future child would be born with serious disabilities. Our intuitions rebel against the conclusion that such behavior could be acceptable, yet the logic appears airtight. The disabled child cannot be said to have been harmed because their very existence depends on their parents' harmful behavior, and they are still living a life worth living despite their disabilities. We have normalized a kind of philosophical blindness around this problem, proceeding as though we can make straightforward moral judgments about reproductive choices and parenting decisions, while the underlying logical foundation crumbles beneath our feet, leaving us uncertain whether we are even capable of wronging people through reproductive decisions at all. Yet this uncertainty has profound practical consequences. It threatens to undermine our ability to condemn practices like genetic selection for disability, the deliberate impoverishment of future generations through environmental destruction, or the creation of children destined for lives of suffering, since in each case the affected individuals might not exist at all without the very decisions we find morally abhorrent. Imagine sitting in a courtroom where a person stands accused of a terrible crime, and the judge prepares to issue a sentence that will determine the course of their remaining years, all while a peculiar philosophical shadow looms over the entire proceeding, suggesting that nothing anyone in that room did was actually chosen at all, that every word spoken, every decision made, every thought entertained was merely the inevitable result of prior causes stretching back to the beginning of the universe itself. This is the unsettling territory of hard determinism, a philosophical position that insists the future is completely fixed by the laws of physics and the initial conditions of the universe, that free will is nothing more than an illusion we maintain out of psychological necessity rather than logical truth. The mechanism underlying this perspective rests on a seemingly airtight logical chain. If the universe follows deterministic physical laws, if every event is caused by preceding events, if your brain is a physical system subject to these laws, then your decisions cannot be free in any meaningful sense, because they were determined by states of affairs that existed before you were even born, states entirely beyond your control. Yet what remains profoundly strange is how thoroughly we continue to function within a framework of moral responsibility, punishment, and praise, despite the hard determinist insisting that this framework rests on a false premise, that we cannot coherently hold anyone responsible for actions they could not have done otherwise, actions that were simply written into the fabric of reality long before the agent took their first breath. We persist in this contradiction not because we have solved it, but because the alternative would be psychologically catastrophic and practically unlivable. Because the moment we truly internalize hard determinism, we face an impossible choice between accepting a world without genuine moral agency and simply continuing to act as though we possess it anyway, all while knowing, deep in our rational mind, that every choice we make was already determined from the beginning of time. Perhaps this is why hard determinism remains a fringe position despite its logical rigor, because to truly believe it would require us to fundamentally restructure not just our justice systems and moral practices, but the very language we use to describe human agency, transforming every "I chose" into "it happened through me," and every assignment of blame into a mere mechanism of social control rather than a judgment of moral culpability. Imagine yourself standing in a courtroom where a defendant has just been found guilty of a crime, and the judge is about to hand down a sentence that assumes this person made a genuine choice, that they could have acted differently, and that they deserve punishment for their decision. Meanwhile, in the back of the courtroom sits a neuroscientist who knows that every action this defendant took was the result of neural firing patterns, chemical reactions, genetic predispositions, and environmental factors stretching back to their childhood, all of which were themselves determined by prior causes reaching back to the beginning of the universe. Yet the judge proceeds anyway, treating the defendant as a morally responsible agent deserving of accountability, and society seems entirely comfortable with this approach. This tension lives at the heart of compatibilism, a philosophical position that attempts to reconcile two seemingly irreconcilable truths: that the universe operates according to deterministic laws where every event is caused by prior events, and yet we can still meaningfully speak of free will and moral responsibility. The compatibilist argues that free will does not require the ability to have acted otherwise in some absolute universe-rewriting sense, but rather requires only that you acted according to your own desires, reasoning, and character without external coercion or constraint. When you choose chocolate over vanilla ice cream because you genuinely prefer chocolate, and nothing forced that preference upon you, you have exercised free will compatibly with a deterministic universe. The mechanism beneath this philosophy rests on a careful redefinition of what we mean by freedom and responsibility, shifting the question from an impossible metaphysical puzzle about whether determinism and free will can coexist, to a pragmatic question about what conditions make punishment and praise rational tools for shaping behavior. The compatibilist recognizes that our legal and moral systems function entirely on the assumption that people can be held accountable, and that this assumption works remarkably well in predicting and modifying human behavior, regardless of whether some absolute metaphysical free will exists. What persists despite the logical challenges is society's unwavering commitment to moral responsibility, punishment, and the attribution of agency, because these concepts prove functionally essential to civilization itself. We have normalized a philosophical compromise that acknowledges determinism while maintaining the framework of accountability, treating it not as a paradox requiring resolution, but as a practical necessity that allows us to hold one another responsible while the universe unfolds according to its deterministic laws. Imagine yourself standing at a crossroads in life, facing a genuine decision between two meaningful choices, and you experience an undeniable sense that you could go either way, that the future genuinely hangs in the balance and awaits your authentic choice rather than being predetermined by prior causes. This is the lived experience that libertarian free will attempts to explain and defend, the intuitive conviction that when you deliberate about what to do and ultimately decide, your choice emerges from something within you that transcends mere mechanical reaction to circumstances and prior states of affairs. The libertarian free will position asserts that humans possess a special kind of agency that is neither wholly determined by prior causes nor entirely random, a middle ground where conscious deliberation and decision-making constitute a genuine causal force capable of altering the course of events in ways that matter morally and practically. This theory operates on the premise that determinism is false, that the universe contains genuine openness and possibility, and that human consciousness possesses the remarkable capacity to exercise control over behavior through reasoning and choice in ways that make us authentically responsible for our actions. The psychological mechanism that sustains belief in libertarian free will, despite its philosophical difficulties, lies in our immediate subjective experience of deliberation and decision, the felt sense that we are agents actively shaping our futures rather than passive observers of predetermined outcomes unfolding before us. Our brains appear to generate this powerful illusion or intuition through the way consciousness processes information, creating a sense of authorship and control over actions, even though neuroscientific findings increasingly suggest that much of what we do originates in unconscious processes that precede conscious awareness. Yet we continue to organize our legal systems, moral frameworks, and interpersonal relationships around the assumption that people possess libertarian free will, that they could have acted otherwise, and therefore deserve praise or blame, punishment or reward, because abandoning this belief threatens the foundation of personal accountability and human dignity. This persistence in the face of scientific skepticism reveals how deeply libertarian free will is woven into our conception of personhood and morality, how compelling the phenomenology of choice remains even when rigorous philosophical and empirical analysis raises serious doubts about whether such libertarian agency is genuinely possible, or whether we might be elaborate biological systems responding to causes in ways that are fully consistent with a deterministic universe. Imagine a universe that has already happened, where every choice you will ever make has already been made, and every moment of your life stretches out in a four-dimensional landscape that simply awaits your experience of it, like a film that has already been shot but is only now being screened before your eyes. This is the essence of predestination, a concept that haunts the intersection of physics, theology, and personal experience, suggesting that despite our powerful intuition of free will and our lived sense of making meaningful choices, everything that occurs may have been determined from the very beginning of time or even exist in some eternal present where past, present, and future are equally real. The mechanism behind this philosophical vertigo emerges from several distinct but converging ideas that together create a compelling argument for why predestination might be true. First, there is the logical observation that if God or some omniscient being exists outside of time, then that being would necessarily know every future event with absolute certainty. And if something is known with certainty to occur, it seems logically impossible for it to occur any other way, which means our choices cannot truly be free even though they feel free to us. Second, modern physics has revealed through determinism that every event in the universe follows necessarily from prior physical states and the laws of nature, meaning that given an exact configuration of all particles at any moment in time, the entire future becomes mathematically inevitable, and consciousness appears to be an emergent property of these physical processes rather than a force capable of breaking the chain of causality. Third, there is the curious phenomenon of temporal block universe theory, which suggests that time does not flow or progress as we experience it, but rather all moments in time exist simultaneously in an eternal four-dimensional structure, meaning that your future self exists right now as concretely as your present self does, and you are simply moving through this pre-existing landscape. What makes predestination particularly strange is that we have developed elaborate ways of living as though it is not true, maintaining robust beliefs in personal responsibility, moral culpability, and meaningful choice. Even as we build scientific models and consider philosophical arguments that suggest these beliefs might be illusions or at least deeply confused about the nature of reality. Consider the moment you taste chocolate for the first time, when the rich sweetness floods across your tongue and you experience what philosophers call a quale, the raw subjective feeling of that particular sensation that exists only in your mind as a private, irreducible experience. Now consider that neuroscientists can map every neural firing, every chemical cascade, every synaptic connection involved in that moment of tasting, and yet no amount of objective physical description will ever fully explain why chocolate tastes the way it does to you specifically, why the sensation feels like something rather than nothing at all. This is the hard problem of consciousness, first articulated formally by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995, though humans have grappled with it for centuries. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental gap between what we can measure objectively in the physical world and what we experience subjectively in our inner mental lives. We can describe the wavelength of light, the neural correlates of seeing red, the evolutionary advantage of color vision, yet none of these objective facts explain the subjective experience of redness itself, the phenomenal quality of what it is like to see that color. The hard problem emerges from this explanatory chasm because physical descriptions are inherently third-person and quantifiable, whereas consciousness is inherently first-person and qualitative. We can reduce any objective phenomenon to physical processes, but consciousness seems to possess an irreducible subjective character that escapes such reduction. What makes this persist despite our scientific advancement is that we have naturalized the mystery rather than solved it. We speak of consciousness as though it were merely another biological function, like digestion or respiration, something that surely will yield to future scientific understanding once we simply map the brain thoroughly enough. Yet after decades of neuroscientific progress, the explanatory gap has not narrowed appreciably. Some philosophers suggest consciousness might be fundamental to reality itself rather than emergent from it. Others argue the problem is unsolvable in principle, that subjective experience and objective description belong to different categories entirely. Still others claim the problem itself is poorly formed, a confusion of language rather than a genuine mystery. Yet none of these positions has achieved consensus, and the hard problem continues to resist resolution with the same puzzling force it possessed generations ago, persisting as perhaps the deepest remaining question in philosophy of mind. Imagine sitting across from another person at a cafe, watching their face contort in what appears to be laughter, their body shaking with what seems like genuine amusement, yet you find yourself suspended in a peculiar form of philosophical uncertainty. You cannot actually know with absolute certainty whether this person experiences consciousness the same way you do, or indeed whether they experience anything at all. This is the foundational puzzle of the other mind's problem, one of the most unsettling questions in philosophy that quietly undermines our most basic assumptions about the nature of human connection and mutual understanding. The problem emerges from a simple but devastating logical observation. You have direct and immediate access only to your own mental states, your own subjective experiences, your own inner world of sensations and thoughts and emotions, while everyone else around you remains forever locked behind the impenetrable barrier of their own skull, accessible to you only through their behavior and their words. You see someone recoil from a hot stove, hear them cry out in apparent pain, watch them perform all the behavioral markers associated with suffering, yet the actual felt quality of their pain, the raw qualitative experience known as qualia in philosophical circles, remains fundamentally inaccessible to your direct observation and verification. The mechanism driving this problem is rooted in the asymmetry of consciousness itself. Your own mental life is known to you through immediate introspection, a form of knowledge so intimate and direct that it serves as your only truly unquestionable certainty. Yet this very intimacy means you cannot extend it outward to confirm the inner lives of others. You might argue from analogy that because other people have brains similar to yours and bodies that behave similarly to your own, they must have conscious experiences similar to yours. Yet this inference operates through probability and reasoning rather than through the kind of direct verification you possess for your own mind. What makes this problem particularly fascinating is how completely we manage to function and build entire societies despite this logical abyss. How we have normalized the assumption that others possess minds essentially identical to our own without ever resolving the fundamental philosophical impasse. We conduct relationships, practice empathy, establish moral systems, and create laws all predicated on the conviction that consciousness exists in others, that their suffering matters because they genuinely feel it, that their joys are real and valuable because they authentically experience them. Yet we do all of this while remaining technically unable to prove that anyone other than ourselves actually has any conscious experience whatsoever. Imagine standing at the edge of a theoretical precipice where the very fabric of causality threatens to unravel, where time travelers could potentially return to the past and murder their own grandparents, creating impossible paradoxes that would shatter the logical consistency of reality itself. This is the domain where Stephen Hawking's chronology protection conjecture emerges as one of the most haunting ideas in theoretical physics, a principle that suggests the universe itself might be fundamentally opposed to the existence of closed time-like curves, or in simpler terms, paths through spacetime that loop back upon themselves and permit travel into the past. The conjecture arose from a curious observation that while Einstein's equations of general relativity permit such paths mathematically, no one has ever observed them in nature, and Hawking proposed that this absence might not be mere coincidence, but rather evidence of some undiscovered law of physics that actively prevents time travel from ever becoming possible. What makes this idea psychologically compelling is that it addresses a primal human anxiety about causality and consequence, the deep-seated sense that effects must follow causes, and that the order of events must remain eternally fixed and immutable. And yet the mathematics of relativity seem to suggest that such temporal loops were not just philosophically troubling, but potentially allowed by the laws of nature themselves. The conjecture operates on the principle that the universe might possess a self-healing mechanism, an invisible guardian that forbids paradoxes by preventing the very circumstances that would create them from ever arising in the first place. Whether through quantum effects at the Planck scale, exotic matter requirements that cannot be satisfied, or some entirely unknown principle yet to be discovered by physics. What is remarkable about how this idea has persisted despite remaining unproven is that it appeals to our intuition that reality must be fundamentally coherent and non-contradictory. And this intuition has become so normalized in our thinking about time and physics that we rarely question whether the universe truly owes us such logical consistency, or whether it is simply our deeply human desire for order imposing itself upon the cosmos. Yet perhaps this yearning for temporal order reveals something equally profound, that in seeking to understand whether the universe forbids time travel, we are really asking whether the cosmos shares our need for narrative coherence, whether causality is a fundamental law written into the fabric of spacetime or merely a comforting story we tell ourselves to make sense of an indifferent, mathematically permissive universe. Imagine standing at a point in spacetime and traveling forward through time in such a way that you eventually loop back to the exact same point where you began, creating what physicists call a closed time-like curve, a path through the fabric of reality itself that curves back on itself temporally rather than spatially, allowing a traveler to return to their own past without ever violating the local laws of physics at any single moment along the journey. This is not science fiction invented by imaginative storytellers, but rather a genuine solution that emerges from Einstein's field equations when we consider certain exotic geometries of spacetime, particularly around rotating black holes described by the Kerr metric or within the theoretical construct of a Tipler cylinder, where the very structure of reality could theoretically permit such closed loops in time. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept so profoundly disorienting is that it forces our intuitive understanding of causality into a pretzel shape, because if you could travel into your own past, then the entire framework of cause preceding effect crumbles into a logical paradox. And yet mathematically, there is nothing inherently impossible about it, nothing that screams violation of fundamental laws at the local level. Even though the global structure of such a universe would be fundamentally strange. We have normalized this impossibility in theoretical physics by acknowledging that while closed time-like curves are mathematically permitted by general relativity, nature itself may have a powerful reason to forbid them through some principle we have not yet discovered, a concept called the chronology protection conjecture proposed by Stephen Hawking, suggesting that the laws of physics might conspire to prevent time travel not because they must, but because the universe is somehow protecting itself from paradox, and this strange acceptance of mathematical permission paired with physical prohibition sits comfortably in modern physics education, despite its deeply unsettling implications about the nature of reality and determinism and free will. Yet if we take closed time-like curves seriously, even hypothetically, we must confront the unsettling possibility that the universe might be self-consistent in ways we cannot fathom, that paradoxes might be prevented not by physics forbidding time travel, but by reality itself being constrained such that any journey backward in time would necessarily unfold in a way that never actually changes the past. A notion so philosophically troubling that it suggests our very concept of free will might be an illusion born from our narrow perspective bound to a single direction through time. Imagine standing in a vast library where every book that has ever existed and ever will exist sits simultaneously on the shelves, each one equally real and present, not as abstract possibilities or memories or future plans, but as concrete, existing objects in the same way your coffee cup exists right now on your table. This is the essence of eternalism, a philosophical position that suggests the past, present, and future all exist with equal ontological status, meaning that yesterday's breakfast, today's moment of reading these words, and tomorrow's sunset are all equally real and present, just located at different points along the dimension we call time. When you consider this perspective, the universe becomes something like a four-dimensional block, a sort of cosmic crystal where every event, every conversation, every thought, and every moment of human experience exists timelessly and eternally, laid out like coordinates on an infinite map rather than flowing like a river from one moment to the next. The psychological mechanism underlying eternalism operates on a logical extension of how we already treat spatial dimensions. We accept that New York exists even when we are in Los Angeles, that Australia is real even though we cannot currently perceive it, and we do not believe that distant places cease to exist simply because our attention has moved elsewhere. So eternalism applies this same reasoning to the temporal dimension, arguing that past and future moments possess the very same kind of existence as the present moment, merely separated by a temporal distance rather than a spatial one. What makes this theory particularly difficult to dismiss is that it emerges naturally from our best scientific understanding of physics, particularly Einstein's theory of relativity, which portrays time not as a universal present moment that moves forward, but as a dimension interwoven with space, suggesting that the distinction between past, present, and future may be nothing more than a feature of human consciousness rather than a fundamental property of reality itself. Yet despite its logical coherence and scientific plausibility, we continue to live as though the past has vanished and the future does not yet exist, as though only this precise instant is real, as though we are surfing forward on a wave of becoming, and this persistent intuition remains deeply embedded in human experience, in our languages, in our moral frameworks where we hold people responsible for past actions, and in our hopes and fears directed toward futures that feel fundamentally open and undetermined rather than already eternally fixed. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast temporal landscape where only this single moment, the precise now in which you exist, holds any genuine reality whatsoever. Everything behind you in the past has ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, fading into nothing more than memory and record, while everything ahead in the future remains equally unreal, existing only as potential and possibility in our minds. This is presentism, one of the most radical and philosophically disorienting theories about the nature of time itself, suggesting that the present moment is the only time that truly exists, that the past is genuinely gone, and the future genuinely not yet here in any substantive way. In our everyday experience, we naturally treat the present as somehow special and immediate, yet presentism takes this intuition to its logical extreme, arguing that when we discuss yesterday's events or tomorrow's plans, we are not actually referring to things that exist in any real ontological sense. The mechanism underlying this theory operates through a particular interpretation of reality's fundamental nature. If we examine existence objectively, we must ask what it means for something to exist, and presentists argue that true existence requires presence in the current moment, that only what is happening right now possesses genuine being. This creates a peculiar temporal ontology where reality is perpetually replacing itself, where each moment flickers into being and then vanishes entirely, leaving only traces and memories in our conscious experience. Yet despite the logical difficulties this theory creates, despite the profound challenges it raises for how we understand causality, history, science, and even our own identity across time, presentism persists as a serious philosophical position because it captures something intuitive about human consciousness. The overwhelming sense that the present is uniquely real and vivid, while memories feel ghostly and the future feels abstract and uncertain. We have normalized this perspective by constructing our entire experiential world around the assumption that now is what matters, that the present is where life actually happens, where decisions are actually made, where reality actually unfolds, even though this deeply conflicts with our scientific understanding of time as a dimension no different from space in the fundamental structure of the universe itself. Imagine standing at a specific moment in your life, perhaps right now as you listen to these words, and consider the peculiar sensation that the present moment is somehow special, somehow more real than yesterday or tomorrow. That time flows like a river carrying you from past to future in a direction you can feel but never quite grasp. This intuition, so fundamental to human consciousness and our experience of existence, forms the basis of what philosophers call presentism, the belief that only the present moment truly exists while past and future are either gone or not yet real. Yet the block universe theory, emerging from physics and philosophy of time, suggests something radically different, something that dissolves this cherished sense of temporal flow into something far stranger and more static. In the block universe, sometimes called eternalism, the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously and with equal reality, stacked together like pages in a book or frames in a film, forming a four-dimensional block of spacetime where all moments exist eternally alongside one another, and the distinction between past, present, and future becomes merely a matter of perspective rather than fundamental reality. This conception arises directly from Einstein's theory of special relativity and the mathematical structure of spacetime itself, which treats time as essentially identical to the three spatial dimensions, implying that all points in time possess the same ontological status, the same degree of reality and existence as any other point in spacetime, much like how all points in space exist whether or not we happen to be standing at those locations. When we experience the present moment as flowing or advancing, we might actually be experiencing something more like the movement of our own perspective through a static four-dimensional landscape. A consciousness traveling along a world line through time the way your eye moves across a page, without the page itself moving or changing. The psychological mechanism that sustains our rejection of this theory, despite its logical coherence, involves what neuroscientists call temporal presentism as an evolved feature of consciousness, a mechanism that creates the vivid illusion of now as special, because such an illusion proves tremendously useful for an organism that must navigate a world moment by moment, making decisions and predictions based on the assumption that only the immediate present requires attention and action. Imagine yourself standing at one end of a hallway and you decide to walk to the opposite end. Before you can reach that far wall, you must first travel half the distance to it, covering 50% of the journey. But then, before you can complete the remaining half, you must traverse half of that remaining distance, which brings you to 75% of your goal. Yet before you finish that portion, you must again cover half of what remains, and this process continues infinitely, subdividing the remaining distance into smaller and smaller fractions that never truly reach zero. This is the essence of Zeno's paradox of dichotomy, a thought experiment conceived by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea around 2,500 years ago, and it presents a deeply unsettling logical puzzle about the nature of motion, infinity, and how we understand the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The mechanism underlying these paradoxes operates through the tension between discrete mathematical infinity and the continuous experience of time and space that we inhabit in our daily lives. When we apply rigorous mathematical analysis to physical motion, we discover that completing any journey requires traversing an infinite number of smaller intervals, and our intuitive understanding struggles with the concept that an infinite series of tasks can somehow be completed in finite time. The paradox forces us to confront a fundamental question about whether infinity is merely a mathematical abstraction, or whether it genuinely exists within the structure of reality itself, whether the space between 2 points is infinitely divisible, or whether there exists some smallest unit of distance or time that cannot be subdivided further. Despite mathematicians developing sophisticated solutions through calculus and the concept of converging infinite series, which elegantly demonstrate that infinite sums can indeed produce finite results, these paradoxes persist in our collective consciousness as genuinely thought-provoking challenges to our understanding of reality. We have normalized the paradox by accepting the mathematical solution without fully reconciling it with our phenomenological experience of motion, existing in a comfortable tension between knowing that motion must be possible, because we observe it constantly while simultaneously acknowledging that the logical structure of infinitely divisible space presents genuine conceptual difficulties that resist complete intuitive resolution. Consider the person who wakes each morning, moves through their routines with practiced efficiency, responds to obligations with automaticity, and retires each evening without ever pausing to ask themselves what any of it means or whether it aligns with who they actually are or wish to become. They attend their job, perform their duties, collect their paycheck, return home, consume entertainment, sleep, and repeat this cycle for decades without ever stepping outside of it to observe it clearly. They may experience moments of vague dissatisfaction, a nagging sense that something is missing or wrong, yet they never sit with these feelings long enough to investigate their source. When discomfort arises, they distract themselves with busier schedules, more entertainment, more consumption, or they rationalize their circumstances as simply the way life is supposed to be. This is the condition of the unexamined life, and it appears far more common than we might initially assume. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is surprisingly straightforward. Examination requires stepping out of one's immediate experience and into a reflective space where one observes oneself as an object of inquiry. This metacognitive shift demands both time and psychological discomfort, because honest self-examination often reveals contradictions between what we claim to value and how we actually spend our time and energy. It requires acknowledging that we may have inherited beliefs we never chose, that we may be living according to someone else's definition of success, that we may have accepted limitations we imposed on ourselves years ago for reasons we no longer remember or perhaps never fully understood. The mind naturally resists this kind of scrutiny because it threatens the coherence of our self-narrative, the story we tell ourselves about who we are and why our lives are the way they are. What makes this particularly persistent is that modern society is specifically engineered to prevent examination. We are surrounded by constant stimulation, endless tasks demanding our attention, and cultural messages insisting that busyness itself is a virtue and that the unexamined life is perfectly normal and acceptable. The voices encouraging reflection have become quieter, pushed to the margins by the roaring machinery of productivity and consumption that rewards us for staying in motion and punishes any extended pause with the anxiety of wasted time or missed opportunities. Yet the cost of this avoidance accumulates silently, in relationships that never deepened because vulnerability was never explored, in talents that withered unused because their pursuit seemed impractical, in a slowly dawning sense that one's own life is something that happened to them rather than something they chose. For thousands of years, humans have posed perhaps the most fundamental question of existence. What is the meaning of life? People spend their entire days contemplating this mystery, lying awake at night wrestling with existential dread, attending philosophy lectures and religious services in hopes of discovering some grand cosmic purpose that would justify their consciousness and effort. They read ancient texts, consult spiritual leaders, meditate in silence, and engage in lengthy conversations with friends about whether meaning is something to be discovered or something to be created, whether it comes from God or from within ourselves, whether it exists objectively in the universe or is merely a comforting illusion we construct to make sense of an indifferent cosmos. The psychological mechanism underlying this obsession is remarkably elegant. Human brains are pattern recognition machines that evolved to find meaning and intention everywhere, even when none objectively exists. Our ancestors who saw a rustling bush and assumed a predator was hiding there survived more often than those who dismissed it as meaningless wind, so we became creatures hardwired to search for significance, purpose, and narrative structure in the randomness of reality. This same mechanism that once kept us alive now drives us to impose meaning onto a universe that may be entirely neutral and purposeless, to believe that our individual lives matter within some larger context, to seek destiny rather than acknowledge the possibility of cosmic meaninglessness. Yet what is truly fascinating is how we have normalized this existential anxiety rather than resolved it, accepting the unsettlable nature of the question itself as somehow sufficient, treating the search for meaning as though the search itself is the meaning, creating an infinite philosophical loop that can never terminate in any definitive answer. We have built entire civilizations, religions, and value systems on the bedrock of this unanswerable question, and we continue to do so despite having no logical reason to expect that the universe owes us any explanation or that meaning exists anywhere except in our minds. And yet this very act of meaning-making, whether through raising children, creating art, pursuing justice, or simply loving another person, appears to be the closest we come to answering the question, not because these activities reveal some pre-existing cosmic purpose, but because they are the substance of a life consciously lived.